Hi, everybody. Tonight, I invite you to close your eyes and let your thoughts drift gently across time. Imagine your soft duvet melting into a stiff cotton sheet, the scent of lavender and coal dust drifting faintly through the morning air. The street below is quiet, save for the rattle of a horse-drawn cart and a distant bell tolling. Your fingers tighten around the edge of a quilt that isn't yours, and when you finally rise, it's to a reflection in the mirror that is unfamiliar. You are no longer you, not as you knew yourself. You have awakened as a Victorian woman in the year 1860. This is a story of disorientation and discovery, of corsets and candlesticks, of whispered secrets, tea-room politics, and the strange hush of a world just on the cusp of modernity. In this slow-burning tale, you'll move through 24 chapters, each more intimate than the last. We'll unravel it like silk, one stitch at a time. So if you're ready, breathe deeply, settle in, and let's begin with the very first morning. The first thing you notice is the cold, not the sharp, bitter bite of winter air, but a still, indifferent kind of cold that seems to hum from the floorboards beneath you. Your eyes flutter open slowly, and light spills in from a tall, narrow window covered in sheer white muslin. It is not the kind of window you remember. And the bed? Oh, the bed, high and imposing, with carved mahogany posts and a threadbare curtain pulled half aside. It takes a moment to process what you're seeing. The ceiling above is not familiar, decorated with a delicate rosette of plasterwork. The furniture is sparse but ornate, and everything carries a kind of aged grace. There is no hum of a heater, no distant buzz of traffic, only silence and that odd rattling clatter from beyond the door. You sit up slowly. Your arms feel thinner, your hands delicate and almost translucent in the pale morning light. When you push the blanket aside, your fingers brush against rough linen. Not your sheets, not your pajamas. You're wearing something long, white, and stiff at the collar. A nightgown, you realize. A Victorian nightgown. For a second, the room spins slightly as your brain tries to cling to logic. Was it a dream? A prank? Virtual reality gone wild? But as you slide off the mattress and your bare feet touch the freezing floorboards, it all feels far too real. The air smells different. Thicker, dustier, touched by oil lamps and old wood. There is a mirror, and drawn toward it like a moth to a candle, you rise. Your reflection stares back at you. Pale skin, long dark hair tied loosely with a ribbon. Eyes wide and unfamiliar, but somehow they hold your own soul behind them. You reach up and touch your face. The woman in the glass does the same, slowly. She is beautiful, but not by modern standards. Her cheeks are softer, fuller. Her brow is unplucked, her lips bare. There is no makeup, no contour, and yet there's something about her that draws you in. Something quietly powerful in her posture, despite the obvious vulnerability of standing alone in an unknown century. Your heart pounds with questions. Where are you? Who are you supposed to be? Is there a name, a life, already written for this body you now inhabit? As if in answer, there's a light knock on the door. You freeze. Another knock, slightly firmer this time. A soft voice follows. Miss, are you awake? You don't respond at first. The doorknob turns and a young girl steps in. She can't be more than 16, wearing a dull gray dress and a white apron. Her hair is pinned neatly. Her expression is deferential, though curious. She lowers her eyes quickly. Beg pardon, miss, she says, but the water's hot, and Mrs. Weatherby said I was to help you dress. Mrs. Weatherby? You open your mouth, then close it again. Say something. Anything. Thank you, you whisper, voice hoarse from shock. The maid gives a shy smile and gestures to a small basin of steaming water on the stand. If you please, miss, I'll fetch your stays. Miss Clementine said you were to wear the lavender day dress for breakfast, and oh, your boots have been polished. She holds up a pair of dainty leather boots with a pride that makes your chest ache. There's so much innocence in her, and she looks to you as if you're someone important, someone expected. And then it hits you. You are expected. You are not some unknown stranger here. To this household, to this girl, you are someone. Someone named, clothed, and scheduled. A routine already exists, and you're meant to follow it. It is terrifying and exhilarating all at once. You allow her to help you wash, standing awkwardly as she gently scrubs your back with a rag. The water is lukewarm now, but far better than you imagine. She hums as she works, a simple tune you don't recognize. You find yourself wondering about her, what her name is, where she sleeps, what her world is like in this rigid, structured time. But your thoughts are interrupted when she lifts a pale corset and gives you a timid look. If you would, miss? You hesitate. You've never worn one, but slowly you raise your arms and she begins to lace you in. The pressure starts gently, then grows, like a hug that won't let go. You try not to gasp. Is it too tight? She asks. No, just new, you manage. She giggles softly and nods. First mornings always are. She helps you into a dress next, a lavender piece with tiny buttons and a high collar. The fabric is coarse, but there's elegance to it. You feel like a porcelain doll being assembled piece by piece. Gloves, hairpins, a small brooch with a faded miniature of someone's face. There, she says, stepping back. Already, you glance once more in the mirror. The transformation is stunning. You look like someone who belongs here, like a lady from an old painting, ready to descend into some sepia-toned world where time moves differently. But you are still you, buried inside. The maid, still unnamed, curtsies and steps aside. Breakfast is served at 7:30, miss. Mrs. Weatherby is in the drawing room. And then she's gone, leaving you alone again with the echo of carriage wheels in the distance and the sound of your own breath. You cross to the window and part the curtain slightly. Outside is a cobblestone street bordered with soot-stained buildings. A milkman walks past. A child runs by in woolen knickers. A woman in black hurries, clutching a small parcel. This is not a movie set, not a dream. This is 1860, and you have no idea what's waiting for you downstairs. The doorknob was heavier than expected, cool in your gloved hand, with a resistance that told of age and hundreds of turns before yours. As it clicked open, the hallway beyond felt like entering the hushed pages of a forgotten novel. The air was dim and mellow, carrying a faint scent of beeswax, coal smoke, and time itself. Beneath your boots, the floor creaked, a polite whisper of sound rather than a protest. The hallway runner was faded Persian red, its intricate patterns worn where countless feet had passed. The walls were lined with portraits in oval frames, the faces unfamiliar, gazing down with an unsettling mix of sternness and sorrow. You moved slowly, unsure of where to go. The maid had said drawing room, and the word felt both charming and slightly ridiculous, like a relic out of a museum. But as you descended the stairs, wide, wooden, softened by a runner of muted blue, you saw sunlight blooming at the end of a corridor. It poured in through tall windows and glinted off polished brass. A wide open archway yawned into a sitting room filled with quiet elegance. The drawing room. Mrs. Weatherby was already there. She sat stiffly on a tufted chair beside the hearth, though no fire was lit. Her hair was a tidy crown of silver and gray, her dress dark and severe in contrast to her lace collar. She held a cup of tea as though it were part of her anatomy, unmoved by your appearance but acutely aware of it. "Good morning, Edith," she said. Edith. The name fell into the room like a stone into a pond, rippling through your chest. So that was who you were now. Edith. The word fit strangely in your mind, foreign, but beginning to settle like dust on a shelf. You forced a gentle smile, uncertain if it trembled. "Good morning, Mrs. Weatherby," you replied, the words tasting tentative on your tongue. She nodded, satisfied. "Do sit down. Agnes has prepared breakfast in the sunroom, but I wish to speak with you before you go." You obeyed, folding yourself carefully onto the edge of the sofa. The dress stiffened as you sat, the corset pressing into your ribs like a second skeleton. Your posture felt unnatural, but perhaps that was the point. There was nothing casual here, nothing loose or idle. The Victorian world, it seemed, demanded that every inch of you be deliberate. Mrs. Weatherby sipped her tea and set it on a porcelain saucer with a quiet chink. Her eyes, pale blue and sharp as steel, did not blink as she regarded you. "I trust you slept well? There was no fever in the night?" You hesitated, then shook your head. "No, I slept quite soundly." "Good," she said. "I would not have you weakened before the trip." Your heart kicked. "Trip?" you echoed. She gave a faint sigh, as though the very idea of your memory failing was troublesome but tolerable. "Yes, the train, Edith. We are to visit your aunt in Brighton. Don't tell me you've forgotten that as well." "Brighton, train, aunt." You nodded slowly, swallowing your questions. "Yes, of course, been a bit foggy this morning." Mrs. Weatherby accepted this without comment, then rose with quiet effort. "Agnes is waiting. I shall join you shortly, but you must not be late. It would be a scandal if we missed the departure." You stood quickly as she did, almost out of instinct. She walked to the window and stared out, arms folded behind her back. You took this as your cue to leave and stepped backward, careful not to stumble or betray your confusion. Outside the room, the scent of toasted bread and boiled eggs tugged you down a narrower hallway toward what you presumed was the sunroom. It wasn't hard to find. The smell led you directly there. Agnes, another servant, older than the maid from earlier and with a wiry frame, was laying out plates on a pale yellow tablecloth. Glass windows surrounded the room, bathing everything in a soft golden hue that made it feel like morning was blooming indoors. "Miss Edith," she said with a respectful nod, "do sit. I've poured your tea." You eased into the wooden chair and eyed the plate before you. There was toast, still warm, a boiled egg, some butter, slightly melting, and marmalade, thick and golden like amber. No phone, no newspaper with modern headlines, no sound of electronics humming softly in the background. Just the quiet shuffle of Agnes arranging the sugar bowl and the distant song of a blackbird outside. Your mind, meanwhile, was a tempest beneath the surface. You were Edith. You were going to Brighton. You had an aunt there. You apparently lived with a guardian or mother figure named Mrs. Weatherby, and the house had at least 2 servants, possibly more. What did Edith know that you didn't? How would you carry on the illusion of being her? Agnes cleared her throat gently. "Would you like more tea, miss?" "Yes, thank you," you said automatically, and the hot liquid sloshed gently into your cup as she poured. You watched her hands, steady, practiced. Fingernails clean but short. Her knuckles cracked slightly as she replaced the teapot. You wanted to ask her something, anything, but every question felt dangerous. So instead, you tried to gather clues. There was a small book to your right, a travel guide to Brighton, its cover worn. The name Edith Hargrave was written inside in careful looping script, Hargrave. Another breadcrumb. You sipped your tea, surprisingly strong with a faint note of bergamot. The toast was dry, the butter slightly salted. Everything on the table was simple yet composed. Thus, this was not a life of extravagance, but one of precision. As you finished your meal, the maid from earlier returned, her name still unspoken, but her face a comfort now. "Miss Edith," she said, "your trunk has been packed. Will you be wearing the traveling cloak or the blue shawl?" You blinked, stalling. "Which do you think is better?" She considered. "The cloak is warmer, the shawl's prettier." "Then the shawl, please." She smiled and nodded, disappearing once again. Thus you pushed back your chair and stood, full of unease that you tried to bury. Brighton. That meant a train station, people. A whole world of customs and expectations you didn't understand. But perhaps, you thought, that's where the answers would begin. If this was to be your life now, you would have to walk through it one uncertain step at a time. The shawl was made of deep blue wool, soft to the touch and lined with a faint silken trim. As the maid draped it across your shoulders, she gave a quick nod of approval, then stepped back to retrieve your gloves. Delicate things, cream-colored and slightly frayed at the fingertips. You pulled them on with a kind of reverence, your fingers moving slowly, deliberately, still trying to make peace with the body they now inhabited. Downstairs, the clatter of wheels echoed outside the front door. A carriage had arrived, its square silhouette just visible through the long glass panels beside the frame. Agnes moved briskly, carrying a carpet bag with a practiced ease, while the younger maid, whom you still had not had the chance to name, fussed briefly with your hat. It was an elegant piece, modest, with a ribbon the same shade as your shawl. She positioned it just so atop your pinned hair, adjusting a strand behind your ear, then stepped back, her lips parting as if to say something. But she said nothing, only smiled faintly, curtsied, and turned away. Mrs. Weatherby appeared from the corridor like a storm cloud in human form, sharp-eyed, brisk, and bundled in layers of dark wool. Her gloves were already on, and she clutched a small leather reticule with an iron clasp. "The coachman is prompt," she said. "Good. Come now, Edith. Let us not waste the morning." You followed her out the door, blinking against the light. The world outside felt colder than inside, though the air was fresh and still. The sky was overcast, the clouds low and heavy like cotton soaked in gray. The carriage stood ready, its wheels motionless, the horses snorting softly, their breath visible in the morning chill. You climbed in after Mrs. Weatherby, the hem of your dress brushing against the edge of the door frame. Inside, The seats were firm but cushioned, the interior lined in a faded green velvet. The door shut with a dull thud, and the driver's call followed, "Ha!" as the reins cracked and the carriage lurched forward. The city passed slowly beyond the fogged windows. Tall brick buildings, some blackened by soot, loomed in narrow rows. Gas lamps flickered weakly even in daylight, their glass casings already fogged with condensation. Women in bonnets carried baskets draped in muslin. Men in top hats strode with purpose. Children darted between legs and barrels, their laughter mingling with the occasional call of a peddler hawking chestnuts or matches. Everything felt somehow close and far away at once. You watched it all in silence, heart thudding with the weight of both fear and fascination. Mrs. Weatherby spoke only once, and it startled you. "You have been peculiar this morning, Edith." You turned to her slowly, a practiced calm on your face. "I've felt off since waking," you admitted. She studied you for a long moment. "Do you remember what the doctor said?" Your throat tightened. "No," you said, and it was the truth. Mrs. Weatherby exhaled softly, not unkindly. "The mind suffers its own fevers. Memory bends. Do not trouble yourself too greatly. Time will smooth what illness has muddled." You nodded, grateful for the excuse, even if you didn't know the sickness that was meant to explain your strangeness. The rest of the ride passed in silence. When the carriage reached the train station, you were struck by the change in pace. The air was louder here, more mechanical, the scent of coal, grease, and damp stone mixed into a singular Victorian perfume. Porters shouted names and destinations, their caps askew and arms loaded with luggage. Steam hissed from the engines like exhalations from metal beasts. You stepped down with care, your gloved hand in the coachman's as he helped you descend. Mrs. Weatherby followed with less ceremony, directing the porter with a commanding flick of her hand. The building itself was vast and shadowed, its iron arches rising high above with riveted grace. Smoke curled along the ceiling, catching in the beams of light that poured through the upper panes. People moved in elegant rushes, ladies holding parasols even in this cloudy weather, men escorting them with gloved precision. You were swallowed into the crowd, a current of movement pulling you forward. Mrs. Weatherby was a sharp presence at your side, but you felt adrift in a century that moved slower and yet more deliberately than you'd ever known. At the platform, your trunk was loaded into the luggage compartment. A porter in a navy uniform ushered you toward the passenger car. You ascended the short steps into the train, the floor beneath your boots quivering slightly as the engine prepared to stir. Inside, the compartment was wood-paneled and warm. Plush seats faced one another, divided by polished brass rails. You and Mrs. Weatherby settled across from each other, and once again, silence reigned. The train shuddered, then began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency. The city slid away. Fields opened up beyond the windows, mottled green and gold, divided by stone fences and hedgerows. Sheep dotted the hills. A scarecrow stood solemnly in a far-off field, its arms raised to nothing in particular. You stared out the window and tried to breathe. What did Brighton hold? A woman called your aunt, but what was her name? Was she kind? Did she know Edith well? What if you said something wrong? Mrs. Weatherby cleared her throat. Your uncle has arranged for a carriage to meet us at the station. He is likely at the assembly rooms today, but Lady Thomasina expects us for tea. You nodded, filing away the names. Uncle, Lady Thomasina, assembly rooms. The conversation did not continue. It was not the way of things. Instead, she produced a small leather-bound book and began to read, her eyes scanning with a practiced rhythm. You watched the countryside drift by. Your hands sat folded in your lap, fingers clasped tightly in their gloves. You still felt like a stranger in your own body. Every movement had to be studied, every word rehearsed. Outside, the sky brightened slightly. The clouds parted just enough to let sunlight scatter across the landscape. A small village appeared, rooftops in slate gray and brick red, chimneys puffing politely. You wondered what Edith would have done on this train ride, what she might have thought about, whether she loved or feared the sea, what her life had looked like before you arrived in it. And then you realized no one was going to tell you. You would have to listen, watch, pretend, piece her life together like a puzzle of lace and porcelain, all the while concealing your own astonishment at every twist of fate. The train continued on, a soft mechanical lullaby beneath the wheels. You leaned your head against the cold window pane and closed your eyes, just for a moment, imagining what awaited in the salt-kissed air of Brighton. The station at Brighton was a low, sprawling affair, perched like a quiet sentinel at the edge of the bustling seaside town. When the train groaned to a halt, a hiss of steam enveloped the platform, momentarily obscuring the figures waiting just beyond. Then, like a curtain being pulled aside, the mist parted, and the world of Brighton revealed itself, busier, brisker, and brighter than the smog-shadowed streets of London. Mrs. Weatherby stepped down first, her boots clicking decisively on the stone platform. You followed, clutching your shawl closer, as a chill sea breeze swept past, carrying the scent of salt and fishmongers and the faintest trace of something sweet, perhaps the promise of toffee or roasted nuts. There was a liveliness in the air here, a kind of coastal rhythm that throbbed beneath the orderly crust of Victorian formality. The porter followed with your luggage, and a tall man in a dark greatcoat approached with purpose. He was broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, and possessed a nose that looked as if it had once been broken in some youthful misadventure. He touched the brim of his hat. "Mrs. Weatherby," he greeted. She inclined her head. "Mr. Carswell, punctual as always. And Miss Hargrave," he said, turning to you with a respectful bow. "It is a pleasure." You smiled politely. "Thank you. This way, if you please." The carriage waiting outside was finer than the one in London. Polished oak with brass fittings and a plush interior that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and lavender sachets. As you settled into the seat beside Mrs. Weatherby, the horses began to clatter forward, and Brighton came alive around you. Shops with glass windows to bonnets, boots, pastries, and parasols. Children ran with hoops along the cobbled streets. A newspaper boy shouted headlines about a shipwreck and a new railway extension. Somewhere nearby, a woman laughed, freely, musically, though you couldn't see her face. It all felt slightly surreal. You were inside a painting that moved, breathed, and pulsed with life. The sea appeared suddenly, like a great shimmering sheet of hammered pewter, unfolding between buildings and rooftops. It stretched to the horizon, vast and unknowable. You stared at it, mesmerized. There it was, the English Channel, the ocean itself, no longer confined to pictures in textbooks or the distant smell of brine carried through open windows. But the carriage turned inland again, away from the glittering shore. Soon you passed grand homes with ironwork balconies and colorful shutters, vine-covered walls, front gardens of geometrically pruned hedges. Then at last, a house that stood out, not for its size but its dignity. 3 stories, whitewashed, with a blue door and brass knocker polished to mirror shine. This was the place. Mr. Carswell opened the door for you and tipped his hat. "Welcome to the residence of Mr. and Mrs. Rutherford." Rutherford, a name like a bell in the distance. Perhaps that was the uncle Mrs. Weatherby had mentioned. Inside, the entrance hall was bright and clean, paneled in pale wood, with a long mirror above a polished console. A small chandelier of glass droplets caught the afternoon light, scattering it like sugar across the floor. A maid approached and took your shawl with a smile. "The drawing room is prepared," she said. "Mrs. Rutherford is expecting you." Mrs. Weatherby removed her gloves with quiet efficiency. "Come, Edith." The drawing room was sunlit and elegant, with embroidered cushions and ivory lace curtains. A fire danced gently in the hearth, and beside it sat a woman of about 50, dressed in deep plum satin, her hair swept up in an elaborate coil. Her eyes sparkled behind a pair of gold-rimmed spectacles. "My dear Edith," she said, rising with her arms open, "let me look at you." You moved forward, heart fluttering, and allowed her to kiss both your cheeks. "So grown," she said fondly. "You were just a slip of a thing last time I saw you. I hope London hasn't dulled your spirit?" "No," you said softly. "It hasn't." She smiled brightly and gestured to a seat. "Come sit, tell me everything." You obeyed, perching gently on a settee while she poured tea from a porcelain pot painted with violets. The cups clinked delicately as she handed one to you. She moved with effortless grace, every motion honed by decades of afternoon rituals. Mrs. Weatherby accepted hers wordlessly, settling in like an anchor. "Your uncle is out," Mrs. Rutherford said as she stirred her tea. "He's terribly preoccupied with the election season. His committee meets thrice weekly now. Dreadful business, full of shouting and cigar smoke. But I'm pleased to have you both here. Brighton suits you, Edith. It always has. You tried to nod as if you knew this to be true. The tea was light and floral. You sipped slowly, observing the room. On the mantel, a silver-framed daguerreotype showed two girls in matching dresses, one older, one younger. Behind them stood a man with a noble bearing and a rather somber expression. Perhaps your cousin? A childhood you could not recall? Mrs. Rutherford talked freely as you listened, weaving a tapestry of local events and social updates. There had been a fire in Kemp Street, but no lives lost. A neighbor's son had returned from India with a gift elephant for the royal gardens. Lady Thomasina, who apparently adored scandal, had purchased a second house despite still being technically married. All of it washed over you like warm bath water. Names, places, gossip, and yet every detail was a thread, waiting for you to pull it and unravel a clearer picture of Edith's world. Soon the tea things were cleared, and Mrs. Rutherford rose. Your room is ready upstairs, the blue one. I thought you'd like it. You smiled. Thank you. Rest if you need it, she said, pressing your hand briefly. We'll dine at 7, nothing too grand. Just the family. Upstairs, the maid led you to a room on the second floor, its door painted pale blue. Inside, the wallpaper was delicate with faded florals. A writing desk stood beside the window, and the bed was neatly made, its quilt patterned with indigo diamonds. A trunk rested at the foot, and on the dresser, a small framed photograph of a young girl. Her features were delicate, serious. You guessed it must be Edith, years ago. You sat at the edge of the bed, fingers resting on the coverlet. Each place you stepped into built another wall around your strange inheritance. Each voice that greeted you layered the illusion more tightly around your borrowed skin. But here, in this quiet room, you let your breath out slowly, your thoughts drifting back to the sea. What would Edith have written in the journal if she had one? Did she dream of escape? Of love? Or did she live peacefully, unaware that someone, someday, would wear her face and walk her life like a costume? The clock on the mantel ticked softly. For now, you were Edith. And Brighton, it seemed, had only just begun to speak. The blue room felt like it had been waiting. Not just prepared, but waiting. For years, perhaps. For your return. For someone to fill its stillness again. You could almost sense the impression of past afternoons lingering in the air, like a memory caught in fabric. Dust motes drifted lazily in the late-day light, and the faint scent of lavender and beeswax hung near the curtains. You rose slowly, letting your fingers graze the top of the writing desk. Its surface bore faint scratches, the kind only a lifetime of pens and elbows could make. A small inkwell sat patiently in one corner, beside a glass tray of pressed flowers that had browned with time. On the top shelf above the desk, tucked behind a worn copy of The Heir of Red Cliff, you discovered a small leather-bound notebook. Its edges were curled and softened, the spine cracked with loving wear. You hesitated only a moment before opening it. The handwriting inside was looping and elegant, neat rows of ink slightly faded. Not your handwriting, but the words belonged to Edith. Her thoughts, her secrets, or at least some shadow of them. August 17th. The sea was calm today. I walked as far as the cliffs before Mrs. Rutherford's ankle forced us back. I think she believes I'm too melancholy, though she'd never say it aloud. I cannot explain why my heart feels heavier here. I should feel at peace. The gulls cry as if mourning some secret I've not yet learned. You stared at the words, your breath quiet. August 21st, I dreamt again of the garden, the old one. Before we left, there were roses, and someone calling my name, though I couldn't see their face. It was neither frightening nor peaceful, just inevitable. You closed the notebook gently. There were more pages, but you weren't ready to turn them yet. The intimacy of it, like overhearing a voice you weren't meant to catch, made your heart ache. A knock at the door pulled you back into the present. Come in, you said, already smoothing your skirt. The younger maid entered, cheeks flushed from the climb. Her dark hair was pinned haphazardly today, with a wisp falling across her brow. Begging your pardon, Miss Edith, she said, a little breathless, but I've drawn your bath. Mrs. Rutherford thought you might wish to dress early for dinner. Thank you, you replied, and then, before she could leave, you asked, What's your name? She blinked, surprised. It's Clara, miss. Clara. You nodded, fixing it in your memory. She gave a small smile, clearly pleased, and stepped aside for you to follow. The bathing room was at the far end of the hall, warm with steam. Brass fixtures glinted in the gaslight, and the tub was already filled dry, a thin mist rising from the surface. A bar of soap rested on a porcelain dish. No scent, no colors, just clean, utilitarian grace. Clara helped you undress with the quiet detachment of used to the task, folding each item of clothing neatly as it was removed. The corset came last, and as it was loosened, your body exhaled with relief. You lowered yourself into the water slowly, gasping slightly at the warmth. It wasn't hot by modern standards, but to your Victorian skin, it was heavenly. The water closed over your shoulders, and for the first time since waking in this borrowed life, you allowed your body to simply exist. Clara busied herself with arranging your evening dress, something in soft plum silk, she said, with a matching sash. As she moved about, humming faintly under her breath, you closed your eyes and let yourself drift. There were so many questions that hung unanswered. Where was Edith's mind, if you now occupied her body? Had something shattered between the two of you? Had you pushed her aside, or had she fled some unseen catastrophe? You wondered if she was watching, if some part of her still lingered in the corners of your eyes, noting every unfamiliar gesture, every hesitation in your voice. But the water did not answer. After you had dried, Clara helped you dress. The plum gown was lovely, simple, but beautifully cut, with delicate pleating at the shoulders and a row of pearl buttons down the back. She fastened each one carefully, her fingers quick and practiced. "You look ever so fine, miss," she said, stepping back with a proud smile. "Thank you, Clara," you said again and meant it. She led you downstairs once more, and as you descended, you could hear the low hum of conversation, polite, restrained. The dining room was lit with soft lamplight, its long table set with silver, crystal, and bone-white china. The silverware was perfectly aligned, napkins folded like tiny swans. Mr. Rutherford stood as you entered. He was taller than you'd imagined, with a weathered but handsome face and silver at his temples. His waistcoat was embroidered with dark thread, his cravat tied with military precision. He greeted you with a nod and a reserved smile. "Edith, welcome." "Thank you," you replied, inclining your head. The table was not large, intimate, but rather with only 4 settings. Mr. Rutherford took one end. Mrs. Weatherby sat at the opposite. You were placed to his right, beside a seat that remained empty. "That will be Thomas," said Mr. Rutherford, noticing your glance. "He's often late." "Is he your son?" you asked gently. "My nephew," he replied. "Stays with us often during the season. Likes the sea air, I suppose. He's fond of long walks and longer arguments." Mrs. Rutherford chuckled lightly. "He means debates." The door opened then, and a young man stepped in. He was perhaps 25, with dark blonde hair that fell just long enough to appear slightly rebellious. His eyes were striking, a gray-green that flickered with amusement, and he moved with a casual grace that seemed to defy the stiffness of his dinner attire. "Apologies," he said with a crooked smile. There was a rather urgent dispute between the baker's wife and the fishmonger about a cat. Mr. Rutherford raised an eyebrow. "Was it your cat?" "No," said the young man, sliding into the chair beside you. "But I felt morally compelled to offer arbitration." He turned to you then, his smile widening. "Miss Hargrave, I presume?" You nodded, your pulse quickening. "Yes, Thomas Greaves. I'm afraid I'm not nearly as interesting as I make myself out to be, but I do enjoy trying." You laughed softly, surprised at the warmth of it. Dinner proceeded with soft clinks and murmured conversation. The food was hearty, roast beef, parsnips, thick gravy, and suet pudding to follow. You ate carefully, mimicking the pace of those around you, thankful that Edith had not been left-handed or prone to flamboyant gestures. Thomas spoke often, weaving stories of Brighton life with wit and a touch of satire. He seemed drawn to your silences, filling them with questions and mischief. And though you knew you must be cautious, you found yourself responding, smiling, wondering. Who was Thomas to Edith? A friend? A thorn? A distant affection? Or someone just beginning to drift into her world? The meal ended with a toast to good health and temperate seas, offered by Mr. Rutherford in a tone of polite ritual. Glasses were raised, clinked, sipped, and then slowly the evening wound down, the room cooling with the night air. Back in the blue room, you stood by the window and watched the stars emerge over Brighton. The sea, dark now, murmured in the distance. Somewhere in this life, answers waited. You just had to find them before someone asked the wrong question. The moonlight stretched thin across the wooden floorboards of the blue room, like spilled milk just beginning to dry. You stood quietly, arms wrapped around your waist, still dressed in the plum silk gown from dinner, the buttons along your spine gently digging into your skin. The room had settled into its nighttime hush, lamp extinguished, the fireplace down to soft amber coals. But your mind remained wide awake. Behind you, the writing desk still held the little leather notebook, its presence both comforting and quietly haunting. Edith's thoughts, her voice. Yet the echo of it felt muffled, as if she had left the room minutes before you arrived, and her scent still lingered in the air. You finally undressed with slow, deliberate movements, placing the gown on the upholstered bench at the foot of the bed. The chemise felt cool against your skin, and you pulled the blankets up to your chin with a care you hadn't practiced in years. The bed was firmer than your own, the sheets stiffer, but the weight of them was oddly reassuring. You tried to sleep, but the day's images floated behind your eyelids like phantoms. The station steaming with life, Mrs. Rutherford's elegant smile, Clara's hands buttoning your dress with quiet diligence, Thomas Greaves, his gray-green eyes glinting with amusement, as if he saw something in you the others did not. You turned onto your side. The ticking clock on the mantel marked time in solemn beats. Eventually, exhaustion won. When sleep finally claimed you, it was deep and dreamless, like sinking into the ink of an untouched page. You awoke to the sound of soft knocking, 3 polite taps, spaced evenly apart. You sat up slowly, blinking in the gray-blue light of early morning. The world outside was barely awake. The sea breeze crept in through the open upper sash of the window, carrying the scent of salt and damp earth. "Yes," you called, voice thick with sleep. The door opened a sliver, and Clara peeked in. "Forgive me, miss. I didn't mean to wake you so early, but Mrs. Rutherford asked if you'd join her for morning prayers." Morning prayers, of course. That made sense. You nodded, rubbing your eyes. "I'll be down shortly," you said. Clara smiled and disappeared as quietly as she'd come. You rose, washed in the porcelain basin with water that had already gone cold, and dressed in a modest morning gown laid out by thoughtful hands, simple ivory cotton with soft lace cuffs. No corset yet, thank heaven, just the ease of morning rituals. Downstairs, the drawing room had been transformed. A small table had been set near the window with a lace runner, a slender Bible, and a single unlit candle. Mrs. Rutherford sat in her usual chair, hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze distant but serene. She looked up and offered a nod as you entered. "Good morning, Edith." "Good morning," you replied, settling opposite her. The Bible between you bore a worn spine and gilded edges dulled by years of devotion. She opened it to a bookmarked passage, clearing her throat delicately. "Psalm 34 today, a balm for unease." She read aloud, her voice low and measured. "I sought the Lord, and he heard me, and delivered me from all my fears. They looked unto him and were lightened, and their faces were not ashamed." The words washed over you, not in a religious fervor, but in their rhythm, a cadence of another time, of structure and reflection. They were foreign and familiar at once, like lullabies heard as a child but never understood until much later. Mrs. Rutherford finished the passage and closed the book with a gentle snap. "Do you still find comfort in these words?" she asked you, her eyes sharp, searching. You hesitated. "I'm learning to again," you said honestly. She nodded slowly, as if she understood more than you'd said. "That's good. Sometimes one must start over with scripture. The mind and heart are not always ready at the same time." Breakfast followed, quiet and simple. Toast with butter and strawberry preserves, a soft-boiled egg, and weak tea. Mr. Rutherford joined only briefly, exchanging few words before announcing he would be away all day in town. You remained mostly silent, absorbing the customs, the subtleties of behavior. Every gesture seemed steeped in quiet expectations. When Mrs. Rutherford folded her napkin at the end of the meal, you did the same. After breakfast, Clara approached with a hesitant look. "Miss Edith, would you like to walk today?" It was such a small question, but it felt enormous. "Yes," you replied. "I think I would." She brightened and rushed off to fetch your walking boots and cloak. When she returned, she also brought gloves and a small parasol, ivory lace with a pearl handle. You took it all gratefully and stepped outside into the cool, briny air. The town was beginning to wake. Chimneys puffed gray trails into the morning sky. Vendors rolled carts into position along cobblestone streets. Women passed in pairs, bonnets tied firmly, their conversations hidden behind gloved hands. You walk slowly, Clara at your side a respectful few paces behind, allowing you the illusion of solitude while remaining dutifully close. The path curved gently down toward the sea, where the stone promenade stretched along the shore like a spine of old bones. And there it was again, the sea, wild and constant, a different mood than the previous day. The waves foamed more today, the tide restless, the surface churned into peaks that crashed rhythmically against the breakwater. A gull shrieked overhead. The scent of salt stung pleasantly in your nostrils. You stood at the railing, gloved hands gripping the cold iron, and breathed deeply. Something in the wind stirred a thought you couldn't pin down, a memory that wasn't yours, a sensation. You could almost imagine Edith standing here days or years before you, watching the same tide with the same furrow in her brow. What had she been thinking? What had troubled her? A voice pulled you from your reverie. Miss Hargrave. You turned. Thomas stood there, not 10 feet away, leaning on his cane with mock theatricality. His coat was neatly buttoned, a velvet scarf tucked stylishly beneath his collar. His eyes sparkled with amusement. "You're out unusually early," he said. "I feared you'd be trapped under lace and religious verse until noon." "I escaped," you replied, smiling. He grinned. "A true heroine." Clara stepped discreetly back, allowing you both privacy without vanishing entirely. Thomas walked slowly beside you along the promenade, his gait even but relaxed. "You seemed thoughtful last night," he said after a pause. You glanced at him. "Is that uncommon?" "Not for you, but last night it was different, heavier." You swallowed. "I've had a lot on my mind." He nodded, not pressing further. The wind caught a strand of his hair and flung it briefly across his forehead. He didn't brush it away. They say some people read faces the way others read novels. Thomas, you suspected, was one of them. He watched with a quiet intensity that was neither invasive nor flirtatious, just deeply human. Curious. You turned your eyes back to the water. "Do you come here often?" "When I want to feel small," he said, "or large. The sea is good for both, depending on the mood." You laughed softly, your breath visible in the morning air. He paused, resting a hand on the iron railing. "Would you think me terribly strange if I said you've changed?" The words hung between you like the mist. "I wouldn't," you said quietly. He smiled. "Good, then I shall say it again. You've changed. There's something in your eyes, something watchful, like you're trying to learn a song you've only just heard." You looked at him, the wind tossing the scent of the sea between you. "Maybe I am," you said. Neither of you spoke after that for some time. You walked in companionable silence, the rhythmic hush of the waves your only conversation. And somewhere deep inside, where the newness of this world still tangled with your memories of another life, you realized something vital. Thomas was watching, and he was the first to truly see that you were no longer who you had been. The wind had softened by the time you returned to the house. A light hush fell over Brighton's promenade as the morning sun, diffused by a sheet of pale clouds, cast a silver glaze over rooftops and cobbled alleys. Thomas had parted ways with a gentle tip of his hat and a crooked smile, claiming an obligation to visit a widow with suspiciously theatrical opinions. You weren't entirely sure what that meant, but his tone had made you laugh, and laughter, you were finding, was increasingly rare in this quiet, corseted life. Clara met you at the door, cheeks pink from the morning chill. She took your gloves and parasol as naturally as if she'd done so 100 times, though each motion seemed touched by a new gentleness now, something warmer than mere obligation. "There's a letter for you, miss," she said, eyes flicking toward the hall table. You followed her glance. There it was, a single cream-colored envelope with your name, Doc Miss Edith Hargrave, written in an elegant, upright script. The ink was brown, not black, as though the writer preferred old-fashioned pens or simply disliked the sharpness of modern tones. It was sealed with dark red wax, pressed with the mark of a tree, an oak perhaps, its leaves fanned wide in intricate relief. You picked it up carefully. It felt thick, personal. Clara, seeing your expression, excused herself with a quiet nod, disappearing toward the kitchen. Doc, you turned the envelope over once more in your hands before finally breaking the seal. The wax crumbled like a brittle coin. Inside was a single folded sheet of stationery, the same fine paper as the envelope. The handwriting was unmistakable, graceful yet deliberate, each letter formed with conviction. If this reaches you before our meeting, know that I write not out of urgency, but of something quieter, a need to preserve certain thoughts before they dissolve into pleasantries. There is a space between us still, though not of distance. I have felt it grow and shift, like fog between familiar shores. I do not wish to pry, but I hope you know, your silence has a shape. I have begun to recognize its outline. Do not feel that you must reply in ink. I only ask that you bring your whole self when we next speak. Not the Edith others expect, just you. Your fingers curled slightly around the paper. There could be no doubt, Thomas, the letter wasn't romantic. Not quite. And yet it thrummed with something more powerful than affection, a kind of seeing. He had noticed the quiet fracture in your presence, the strain behind the polite smiles and the carefully measured words, the ghost within the shell. And he had written, not to accuse or confront, but to leave a door ajar. You folded the letter carefully and returned it to its envelope, tucking it beneath the novel on your writing desk. Your heart was quieter now, but no less restless. The rest of the morning passed in quiet rituals. Mrs. Rutherford called for you to help choose ribbon samples for the altar cloths at St. Andrew's, an activity she approached with the gravity of naval strategy. You sat beside her in the morning room, nodding thoughtfully as she debated between ivory lace and ecru linen. There was something almost sacred in the way she handled the swatches, her fingers smoothing them as though offering comfort to some invisible sorrow. "Are you fond of needlework, Edith?" she asked at one point. You hesitated, then offered the safest reply. "I find it calming." She gave a nod of approval. "It sharpens the mind, I think, teaches one the rhythm of silence." That phrase lingered with you as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Rhythm of silence. You weren't sure what Edith had found in silence, refuge or confinement. But as the household slipped into the stillness of early afternoon, you decided you could no longer sit and wait for memories to drift back to you like washed up shells. You had to move, search, follow whatever thread this life had begun to lay before you. And so, while the house settled into its midday hush, Mrs. Weatherby in her room resting, Mrs. Rutherford dictating a letter in the study, you found yourself walking quietly toward the far end of the second floor, toward a door Clara had once passed through carrying linens. The servants' quarters. The hallway narrowed slightly here. The walls were bare, the carpet thinner. A low window at the end let in the muted light. The scent changed too, less perfume, more starch and coal dust, more lived in. You knocked gently on one of the doors, half hoping no one would answer. But Clara's voice came, muffled but unmistakably warm. "Yes?" You opened the door slowly. Clara's room was small but tidy, with a narrow bed against the wall and a modest wooden dresser topped with a single ceramic vase. The window looked out over the side garden where the kitchen herbs swayed gently in the breeze. A small framed sketch of a cottage sat on the bedside table. Clara stood at the foot of the bed, folding a chemise. When she saw you, her surprise turned quickly to a polite smile. "Miss Edith, is something the matter?" You stepped inside, careful not to appear too familiar, but your voice came softer than you expected. "No, nothing's wrong. You trailed off, unsure how to finish. Clara tilted her head. "Would you like to sit?" You nodded, and she motioned toward the little chair by the dresser. The two of you sat in silence for a moment. Outside, a bird chirped. A distant kettle hissed in the kitchen. "I've been wondering about something," you said finally, choosing your words with care. Before I was here." Clara's brow creased. "You mean before London?" You nodded. She folded the chemise more slowly now. "Well, you were quieter then, but not like you are now. You used to walk alone more. You kept a journal, I think, though I never saw what you wrote in it. You read a great deal." She paused, glancing at you. "But you were kind, miss, always kind." Your throat tightened. "Did I seem happy?" Clara considered this for a long time. "Then you didn't seem unhappy. But sometimes when you looked out the window, you looked like someone waiting for news." The image struck you, too clearly. You rose slowly from the chair. "Thank you, Clara. That helps more than you know." She stood with you. "Is there anything else I can do?" You started to say no, then caught yourself. "Yes, One thing, could you, just for a moment, tell me something small about me? Something no one else would know? Clara blinked. Then, with a shy smile, she said, "You always put a book in your pocket when you walked, even if you didn't read it. Just liked having it there." You smiled too. "Thank you." You left her room quietly, heart warmed and stung at once. Later that evening, as the house prepared for supper, you reached into the drawer beside your writing desk. The little notebook still sat there. And now, with a kind of quiet reverence, you slipped it into the pocket of your dress. It wasn't your book, but maybe, just maybe, it could help you find the rest of the girl whose name you now carried. The sky was beginning to shift, awash in streaks of honey and pale rose, as the late afternoon light softened the edges of the world. From the window of the blue room, you watched the sun fold slowly into the curve of the sea, its last gold rays flashing over the water like spilled coins. The horizon blurred gently where the sky met the waves, no sharp lines, only the quiet dissolve of day into evening. The little notebook remained tucked in your pocket, its presence grounding you more than you'd expected. A strange kind of comfort, like a whispered secret resting just over your heart. You hadn't read beyond those few early entries. Not yet. Somehow, holding the book felt more important than opening it. You began dressing for supper earlier than necessary, if only to occupy your restless hands. Clara entered at 5:30, a lilac evening gown draped carefully over her arms. It was simpler than the plum silk, but no less elegant. Narrow at the waist with soft pleats at the hem and a small brooch shaped like a crescent moon stitched into the collar. As she laced your stays and fastened the gown's tiny buttons, Clara made light conversation, soft as birdsong. "Mrs. Rutherford says we're to have a custard tart tonight. Cook used real nutmeg. It's not always available, you know. Only when Mr. Rutherford's connections remember the kitchen." You smiled. "I'll look forward to it then." She fixed a final strand of your hair and stepped back with a nod of approval. "There now. You look like yourself again." You glanced toward the mirror. Your reflection was both familiar and elusive. The softness of the gown, the neatness of the collar, the pinched elegance of the hair. Yes, it looked like Edith. But the eyes staring back still held questions, still searched. Downstairs, the dining room was lit with candles tonight, their flames wavering gently in the quiet air. The walls flickered with soft amber, the long table shining beneath polished crystal and cutlery. Mrs. Weatherby was already seated, knitting in hand. Mr. Rutherford entered moments later with a faint smell of pipe smoke clinging to his sleeves. Thomas arrived last. This time, he wore a midnight blue waistcoat with subtle embroidery and a single sprig of rosemary tucked into his lapel. "A tribute," he said, gesturing toward the herb with a flourish. "To Miss Hargrave, whose walks along the promenade have lately rendered all others unnecessary." It was a jest, clearly, but the warmth in his voice lingered just a moment too long. You lowered your gaze to your napkin, but you felt your pulse in your neck. Supper passed in a haze of quiet conversation and the clinking of silver. Mr. Rutherford spoke of a recent political dispute regarding a railway extension north of Lewes. Mrs. Weatherby corrected a misquote from the sermon last Sunday. Clara and another maid brought out the tart, still steaming slightly, the golden surface dusted with nutmeg like ash on snow. You ate slowly, savoring the textures, the pacing of the meal. It reminded you of rehearsed music, no hurrying, no improvisation, just the steady unfolding of ritual. After the dishes were cleared and the candlelight burned lower, Thomas leaned back in his chair, eyes glinting. "Miss Hargrave," he said, "might I tempt you to a walk in the conservatory before the hour grows indecently late?" Mrs. Rutherford raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Mr. Rutherford seemed already half asleep behind his glass of port. Mrs. Weatherby glanced at you over her knitting with that peculiar look that sat somewhere between suspicion and amusement. You nodded. "Yes, I think I'd like that." The conservatory was attached to the west side of the house, a glass-walled room filled with potted citrus trees, ferns, and a few wilting hyacinths. The scent was a pleasant mix of soil, orange blossoms, and damp stone. The night had cooled, and condensation beaded the panes like tiny raindrops. Thomas held the door open for you, then followed at a respectful distance. The room was quiet except for the occasional creak of old wood and the soft rustle of leaves stirred by the breeze that slipped through the open transom. He stopped beside a small iron bench and gestured for you to sit. You did. I hope you don't mind my letter, he said after a moment. You looked at him. No, I don't. I wasn't sure if you'd read it. I did. A beat passed between you. The silence was gentle, not strained. You seemed changed when you returned, he said softly. Not just from London, but inwardly, as though you'd crossed some unseen ocean. Your breath caught just slightly. And you've been kind, he added, but distant, like someone listening through a wall. You lowered your gaze. The little notebook in your pocket felt heavier now. I don't mean to be difficult, you said. I don't think you are. His voice was steady, reassuring. You looked up at him again and found no mockery, no pressure, just that same quiet curiosity that had followed you since the moment he stepped into the dining room. Do you remember, he said slowly, when we saw the eclipse together? 2 summers ago? You shook your head gently. No, he smiled faintly, not surprised. We were down by the edge of the downs. You brought that absurd green bonnet, the one with the feather. Sounds ghastly. It was, he chuckled, but you wore it without apology. And when the moon began to move across the sun, you grabbed my hand without even realizing. Your fingers were freezing. He paused. I think of that sometimes, not because it was dramatic, but because of how natural it felt, unnoticed, as though you always knew where to find warmth. The words pierced you, tender and precise. You searched his face, the flicker of candlelight catching in the green-gray of his eyes. I'm sorry, you whispered. For what? That I don't remember. He nodded slowly. It's all right. I'll remember for both of us. Neither of you spoke again for several long moments. The breeze shifted, carrying in the coolness of the night. Somewhere in the shadows beyond the glass, a fox barked, one sharp, lonely note. You rose slowly from the bench. Thank you for the walk, you said, voice steadier now. He stood with you, gave a small bow. Good night, Edith. You walked back through the quiet corridors alone, passing portraits whose faces seemed to follow you more softly now. In the blue room, the lamp glowed with a low flame, casting gentle halos across the wallpaper. You undressed slowly, brushing your hair in long, even strokes as Clara had once done. You placed the notebook beside your bed, its cover slightly worn where your fingers had pressed earlier, and just before slipping beneath the quilt, you opened it to the next entry. September 2nd. Thomas asked about the eclipse today. I told him I remembered less than I do. It's easier that way, safer, but I fear the cost. He looks at me like he's trying to catch my reflection in water. I'm afraid one day he'll see someone else entirely. You closed the book, heart echoing with a strange blend of sorrow and wonder. Who had you been before this? And what exactly had Edith been afraid of losing? The following morning unfolded with a peculiar softness, as though the world itself were wrapped in a woolen shawl. The clouds outside hung low and heavy, casting the blue room in a dreamy slate-toned haze. Rain tapped gently at the window panes, not a storm, but a persistent whisper of water against glass, steady and contemplative. It was the kind of rain that drew everything inward, that silenced streets and slowed movements, asking you to pause, to notice. You awoke later than usual, the chill in the room coaxing you to linger beneath the covers. The fire in the hearth had long gone out, but the memory of its warmth still clung faintly to the air. You lay still for a time, listening to the rain. Your breath mingled with it, as if your body was trying to learn the rhythm of this new quiet. When at last you sat up, your hand moved instinctively to the nightstand. The notebook was still there, its cover cool beneath your fingertips. You didn't open it. Not yet. It felt like a lantern you might need later, once the day's shadows lengthened. A knock came. Clara again, her presence as dependable as sunrise. Good morning, Miss Edith, she said, stepping lightly into the room. Mrs. Rutherford says there's no need for formality today. She'll be working on correspondence, and the rest of the household may do as it likes. You blinked at her. As it likes? You repeated. She smiled. Within reason, of course. Clara helped you into a soft gray morning gown. The fabric brushed wool, warm, forgiving. She left your hair looser than usual, only half pinned, curls tucked gently behind your ears. The result was simple, but oddly intimate. You looked at yourself in the mirror and saw something new, a softness you hadn't allowed yourself to wear before, as though the life you were stepping into might finally be making room for you. You skipped breakfast, or rather, You excused yourself from the table after a few polite sips of tea and a slice of toast, your thoughts already pulling elsewhere. The others seemed content in their own rhythms. Mrs. Weatherby with her reading glasses perched precariously on her nose, Mrs. Rutherford selecting envelopes by texture alone, Mr. Rutherford nowhere to be seen. You wandered through the house with the calm curiosity of someone searching for forgotten doors. Eventually, your steps brought you to the library. It was on the east side of the house, slightly cooler than the rest, with tall windows that overlooked the sodden garden. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old leather, ink, and pressed paper. Books lined every wall, mahogany shelves rising from floor to ceiling. A ladder with brass wheels rested near the corner, and the fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting long shadows that danced across spines stamped in faded gold. You stepped inside quietly, the door clicking shut behind you. The library was empty. You moved among the shelves slowly, scanning the titles, volumes of poetry, botanical texts, Greek histories, treatises on architecture. There were worn novels with names you recognized: Bronte, Austen, Radcliffe. Others more obscure, their covers cracked and titles nearly illegible. Near the back wall, you found a low table covered in pamphlets and folded newspapers. One corner of it held a stack of letters tied neatly in twine. Someone had been here recently. You paused, then drifted toward a writing desk tucked beside the window. It was tidy, but lived in. A quill rested in a holder beside a small glass inkwell. A blotter, stained and creased. A half-filled page with delicate script lay face down. And though you didn't mean to read it, your eyes caught one phrase. Cannot deny that Edith's presence has grown quieter still, like a room one re-enters after many years. The handwriting was unmistakably Thomas's. Your heart quickened. You turned from the desk and moved toward the far corner where a window seat invited retreat. You sat there, folding your legs beneath your skirt, and gazed out at the garden beyond. Rain fell steadily on the hedgerows, pooling along the stone path that curved through bare rose bushes and down toward the orchard wall. Time passed quietly. Eventually, footsteps approached. You expected Clara, or perhaps Mrs. Weatherby, but it was Thomas. He entered the library with a book in one hand, not yet noticing you. His coat was damp, hair tousled from the walk between the house and whatever outer room he had come from. When he saw you, he paused. "I should have knocked," he said, voice low. You shook your head. "No need. I was only borrowing the silence." He smiled, stepping further in. It's good silence, the kind that seems to listen back. He joined you at the window seat, setting the book beside him. For a moment, the two of you simply watched the rain. There was no pressure to speak, no expectation. Finally, he said, "I remember the first time you came here. You were 13, I think. You sat in that same seat and refused to come down for lunch. Claimed you had an arrangement with solitude." You laughed quietly. "That sounds rather dramatic." "It was, but you meant it. I admired that." You looked at him sideways. "Did I change after London?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "How?" Thomas thought for a moment, choosing his words. "You became more watchful, more careful, as if every word you said had to be measured. But not because of fear, because of something else. Like someone learning a language they used to speak but forgot the rhythm of." You nodded slowly. He looked at you, and for a moment his voice softened. "I know this isn't easy. Whatever it is you're carrying, Edith, or hiding. I don't need to know, but I want you to know." He stopped himself. Then gently, "I'm not here to trap you with memory." You met his eyes. "Then why are you here?" He looked down at the book he had brought. It was a volume of Keats, worn, bookmarked with a torn ribbon. "Because you're still here," he said, "even if differently." He placed the book between you and stood. "I'll let you read," he said, and without another word, he walked to the door and disappeared into the hush of the hallway. You stared at the space he had left behind. Then, slowly, you opened the book. Inside on the title page was a note written in soft pencil, "To Eth who understands quiet the way others understand sound." Your fingers rested there for a long while. Outside, the rain continued, steady and whispering, a rhythm, a promise, a memory just out of reach. Morning light returned hesitantly, breaking through the clouds in pale, diluted shafts. The air held a scent of earth and moss, as if the rain had stirred something old in the soil that now lingered in every corner of the house. From your window, the garden looked damp but alive. leaves glistening, puddles catching sky like broken mirrors. The branches of the sycamores bent low, heavy with yesterday's storm. You rose early, drawn not by obligation but by a restless need to move, to step again into the strange rhythm of Edith's world. You dressed in solitude, a dove-gray day dress with a pleated skirt, the collar stiff but not severe. You pinned your hair back without Clara's help today, imperfectly, leaving a few soft strands loose near your temples. Something about the imperfection felt honest. You found Clara in the downstairs corridor, carrying a stack of linen napkins. "Good morning," you said. She looked up, surprised. "Goodness, Miss Edith, you're up before the kitchen fire's properly hot," you smiled. "I thought I'd walk." "In the garden," you nodded, "unless it's too wet." She hesitated, then said, "There's a path behind the orchard wall, narrow but dry underfoot. No one uses it much this time of year. It leads to the little folly near the brook." You raised an eyebrow. "A folly?" Clara grinned. "A useless building just for looking at, a ruin they built to look older than it is. Your uncle calls it sentimental nonsense, but it's peaceful." The idea stayed with you, a quiet place, forgotten by the household. It sounded like the sort of spot where Edith might have gone when no one was watching. You thanked her and stepped outside. The air met your skin like cool breath, fresh and untainted. A robin trilled from the hedge. The path Clara had spoken of was there, just behind the orchard, a narrow trail, half swallowed by wild ivy and fallen leaves. You followed it, boots sinking slightly into the softened earth. It curved gently, weaving through damp grass and low-hanging branches. At one bend, a cluster of wild mushrooms had sprung up overnight, pale and delicate as moonstones. The quiet here was different from the house's silence. It was older, less constructed. The folly came into view slowly, a small stone structure, arched and moss-covered, with a crumbling bench inside and vines clawing up the outer walls. It was beautiful in its uselessness, like a half-remembered dream. You stepped inside, where the ground was dry and the stone cool beneath your touch. You sat on the bench, folded your hands in your lap, and listened. For a time, there was nothing but the whisper of the wind through the leaves. The brook babbled softly beyond the grove, hidden but near. It felt like a place between house and wild, past and present, truth and pretense. And then, almost instinctively, you pulled the notebook from your pocket. You opened it to the next page. September 7th. The house has grown too quiet. Even the clocks seem to tick with less certainty. Mrs. Weatherby says I've been distant. She means dull. I can't help it. The air feels different now. I can't quite explain how, but I feel watched. Not with malice, but with waiting. Like the walls are holding their breath. I dreamed last night of the folly again. But in the dream, it was not empty. A figure stood just beyond the arch where the moonlight bled through. I could not see their face, only the outline, still and waiting. I didn't feel fear, just inevitability. You lowered the page slowly. The wind picked up outside, rustling the ivy. The dream she described, this same place, this same arch. Was it memory or prophecy? And if so, what did that make you now, sitting where she had once imagined herself? You glanced toward the archway. No figure stood there, only branches and the soft shimmer of dew on grass. But your heart beat faster all the same. You stayed a while longer, watching the light shift across the floor. Eventually, the cold crept in, and you rose. As you turned to leave, something near the edge of the stone bench caught your eye. A faint inscription, nearly worn away by time and weather. You knelt, brushing aside a strand of moss. E.H., 1858, 2 initials, Edith Hargrave. This had been her place too. You traced the letters with one gloved finger before standing. The journey back to the house felt slower, like moving through a story whose pages you were only beginning to understand. Inside, the day had already unfolded without you. Mrs. Rutherford was in the front parlor, writing invitations for a luncheon. Mr. Rutherford had gone into town again. Thomas was nowhere in sight. Clara offered you a warm drink and a seat by the fire, but you declined with a soft shake of your head. Instead, you wandered the halls, thinking. In the upper corridor, you paused before one of the older portraits, a girl in a blue dress, holding a book. Her expression was sober, but not sad. She looked as if she were listening to something beyond the canvas, something just out of reach. Later that evening, you found Thomas in the library. He stood near the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel, eyes fixed on the flames. When you entered, he turned. "You look like someone who's come back from a place with no name," he said. You smiled faintly. "Perhaps I have." He didn't ask where. Instead, he gestured toward the shelf beside him. "Did you know there are 2 books of letters in this house that no one has read?" "No?" "One was written by your great-grandmother, the other by a girl she once knew, a friend who became a stranger. Their letters were never delivered. They just sat there." "Why?" "Because they wrote them knowing they wouldn't be sent. They wrote them to preserve something, to speak without interruption." You looked at him. "Do you believe words still matter if they're never heard?" "I think," he said, "some words are meant to echo, not answer." A silence settled between you. You felt it again, that pull, that invitation, to step closer to the truth, even if it stung, even if it unraveled the illusion entirely. And somewhere inside you, a thought stirred, quiet but unrelenting. Perhaps the person you were before had not disappeared. Perhaps she had only fallen asleep. And this life, with its cold corridors and warm letters and haunting familiarity, was the dream that had come to wake her. The house felt larger in the dark. It was after midnight, and silence had gathered in every corner like soft dust. The lamp in your room had long since burned low, leaving only a faint glow from the dying embers in the hearth. But you were not in bed. Instead, you sat at the writing desk, still dressed in your robe, the notebook open before you, its pages catching the dim firelight like old parchment in a cathedral. Sleep would not come. Your thoughts moved in slow spirals, circling the folly, the letters, the voice you had begun to hear and eat its words. Not as a stranger, but as something woven into the fabric of your own breath. It wasn't possession. It wasn't a haunting. It was something quieter, more intimate, emerging. You turned to the next page of the notebook, fingers trembling slightly with the weight of anticipation. September 10th. Thomas said today that I'm not the same as when he met me. I almost laughed, as though people are statues, unchanging, silent. We are not marble, we're wax, we melt, we reform, and sometimes we forget who first lit the candle. I don't know who I'm becoming. I write letters I never send. I speak in rooms where no one listens, but the words still come. They insist on being heard, even if only by paper. If I disappear one day, I hope someone finds this. Not because I am important, but because I was here. And that mattered to me. You let your eyes close, the page gently swaying in the hush of your breath. The feeling it left behind wasn't sadness, it was recognition, a kind of mirrored sorrow, ancient and immediate. You wondered if all women, across time, across lives, wrote such things in secret, words meant not to be read but to survive. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. You froze. Then, slowly, you closed the notebook, slipped it into your drawer, and padded to the door in bare feet. The hall was empty, lit only by the flicker of a single candle in a wall sconce near the stairs. But something pulled at you. Curiosity, yes, but more than that. A magnetic sense that the house itself was not quite asleep. You stepped out. The carpet muffled your footsteps as you passed the closed doors of the other rooms. Mrs. Rutherford's with its ornate brass handle, Mrs. Weatherby's just beyond the corner, a faint hum of breathing from behind each, peaceful, undisturbed. Downstairs, the front hall glowed faintly with reflected moonlight through the stained glass panel above the door. You descended the staircase slowly, your hand trailing the banister, the wood cool beneath your palm. Then you heard it, the quiet scrape of something soft, paper, fabric, from the library. You approached. The door was ajar. Inside, Thomas sat in the armchair beside the fire, the same Keats volume resting on his knee. He was not reading, just holding it, gazing into the flames. He didn't flinch when you entered. "I couldn't sleep," he said softly, as though expecting your arrival. "Neither could I," you replied. He looked up. His hair was mussed, his shirt collar unfastened. The firelight danced in the hollows beneath his cheekbones. "Some nights," he said, "the silence is louder than the day." You stepped inside and sat across from him, gathering your robe closer against the gentle chill of the room. "Were you reading?" "No," he said, "just remembering." A pause. "Did you know," he continued, "that this was the room where your mother first told your father she loved him? Right by that window." You turned to look. "I didn't," you whispered. "She was younger than you are now. Nervous. He was awkward. But they were honest. And I think honesty is rarer than affection." You folded your hands in your lap. Were you close to her? You asked. Thomas hesitated. Then, I was very young, but I remember her laugh. It came from somewhere deep, and when she held your hand, she made you feel as if you were the only person left in the world. Your breath caught. I wish I remembered more, you said. About her. About that time. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Memories come when they're ready. Sometimes not as pictures, sometimes as scent or warmth, or the way a certain word lingers. I feel like I'm trying to remember someone I never met. He looked at you intently. Maybe you are. You didn't reply. The fire crackled once, shifting its glow. Then, softly, he asked, "What would you do, Edith, if you could start your story over?" You looked at him. Do you think it's ever really possible? I don't know, but I think sometimes the world gives us a moment, a single moment, where we can decide who we are next. You leaned back, resting your head against the velvet of the chair. The firelight warmed your face. I'm afraid of choosing wrong, you admitted. Thomas smiled gently. Then you care enough to choose wisely. Another silence settled between you, but it wasn't heavy. It was like dusk in a chapel, soft, forgiving, sacred. When you finally rose to return upstairs, Thomas didn't follow. He remained there in the chair, the book still unopened on his lap. You walked back through the hall, your steps slower, quieter now. At the top of the stairs, you paused and turned your head just slightly, listening. No sound, but a thought formed, clear and quiet. You were not here to replace Edith. You were here to remember her, to learn from her steps, to carry her voice forward, not as an echo, but as your own. The sky was milk gray the next morning, and the rain had finally gone. In its place lingered a soft fog that clung to the windows like gauze, blurring the edges of the world beyond. Trees stood as silhouettes behind the mist, branches outstretched like fingers through a dream. The garden, heavy with dew, seemed suspended, neither waking nor sleeping. It was a world in between, and somehow it felt fitting. You dressed slowly, deliberately. Clara had left a pale lavender day dress on the upholstered bench, its buttons already loosened for ease. The fabric was light and barely textured, trimmed with a narrow border of cream lace at the cuffs and collar. When you slipped it on, the weight of the past evening still rested over your shoulders, neither heavy nor unwelcome, just present, like a name softly spoken behind you. Downstairs, the house stirred with a different kind of rhythm, not hurried, not quiet, but thoughtful. Mr. Rutherford had left early, leaving behind only the scent of his pipe tobacco and the faintest trace of cologne. Mrs. Weatherby was in the morning room reading the Illustrated London News, her teacup perched on one arm of the chair. Mrs. Rutherford, you were told, had gone to visit a neighbor with a new baby and would not return until luncheon. You found yourself once again drifting, this time not through the house, but toward the garden. Clara had mentioned earlier that the back garden gate was unlocked today for the groundsman to trim the hedgerows near the old dovecote. It was a part of the property you hadn't yet explored, and the thought of it, of hidden paths and overgrown stones, was irresistible. Outside, the fog greeted you like an old companion. It wrapped around your ankles, crept up your sleeves, brushed cool fingers against your cheek. But you weren't cold, not truly. The garden's hush felt sacred, like walking through a place no one had spoken aloud in years. You followed the gravel path past the sunken rose beds and along the edge of the orchard, the same route that led toward the folly. But this time you turned left where the earth curved slightly downward and disappeared beneath a row of yews. The ground was damp and your boots left impressions behind you as you walked. At last, the dovecote came into view. It was a strange little building, circular, stone with a domed roof covered in moss and a wooden door half swallowed by ivy. The small arched openings near the top had once been filled with birds, but now they stood empty, like windows into forgotten sky. You approached slowly, your hand brushing the ivy away from the door. It wasn't locked. It creaked open with the sound of tired hinges and old wood stretching its limbs. Inside, it was darker than expected, the only light filtering through a high slit in the wall. The air smelled faintly of straw and lichen. The walls curved around you in a perfect circle, enclosing you in a quiet so complete it felt like stepping inside a bell just before it rings. On the far wall, something caught your eye, a line of small etched letters, barely visible beneath the grime. You moved closer, brushing at the stone with the edge of your glove. They read, There are things only silence understands. No signature, no date, just those words. A message carved perhaps by a girl like Edith or by Edith herself. You couldn't be sure, but it reached you. You stepped back and sat on the low stone ledge that circled the room, letting the silence gather around you like a cloak. And from your pocket, you drew out the notebook. It opened easily, as though it too had waited for this place. September 13th. Today I walked farther than usual, to the dovecot. It's been empty for months. I miss the sound of wings, the soft cooing. But perhaps the silence suits me more now. It doesn't expect anything. I found the words I carved. I had forgotten them. I remember now. I wrote them after my father left for the last time. I had cried until I couldn't speak, and the only thing that held me together was the soundlessness of the trees. They listened. They didn't need answers. I think, if I had a daughter one day, I would bring her here, show her the wall. Let her know that silence is not emptiness, that sometimes it is the truest way we speak. You closed the notebook gently, reverently. The air in the dovecote held the warmth of something unspoken, a memory without a name. You stayed a while, tracing the walls with your gaze, letting the quiet settle into your bones. Later, back at the house, you found the fire lit in the drawing room. The fog outside had not lifted, but the hearth glowed steadily, casting soft gold across the floorboards. You stood by the mantel, one hand resting on the edge. Thomas entered a moment later, his coat damp with mist. He looked at you for a long time, and then without a word walked to the shelf, retrieved a book, and placed it on the small table near the fire. "Open it," he said. You did. Inside was a blank book, bound in soft leather, pages thick in ivory, new, untouched. "For what's next?" he said simply. You looked up at him. "Thank you." "No," he said. "This one will be yours, not hers." The distinction settled over you like a revelation, and for the first time, the thought no longer frightened you. It didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like invitation, to write forward, to step from shadow into voice. Later that afternoon, when the fog had begun to thin and the air felt almost warm again, you found yourself drawn toward the sitting room, an underused corner of the house with long lace curtains and a dusty pianoforte that hadn't been played in years. The light through the windows was soft and amber tinged, spilling across the carpet in patches like worn pages from a book left out in the sun. No one else was there. You crossed the room in silence, drawn toward the piano. Its dark wood bore the faint sheen of polish, and its ivory keys were yellowed with time. A single brass candle protruded from the front, long since burned down. When you sat, the bench creaked gently beneath you, as if sighing at the memory of sound. You ran your fingers lightly across the keys without pressing, just feeling their smoothness, their weight. You didn't know what song Edith had loved. You didn't know if she'd played at all. But your fingers, as if moved by instinct rather than memory, settled into a simple chord. The sound was soft, a little out of tune, but it echoed gently in the room. You played another, then another, simple harmonies that began to form a quiet melody, a lullaby perhaps, or something close to it. The notes were hesitant at first, but as they spilled forward, they began to fill the silence, and the room seemed to lean in and listen. You closed your eyes. Somewhere in the recess of that moment, time loosened its grip. You were neither Edith nor yourself, neither past nor present, only a breath suspended between keys, a being made of memory and wonder, housed in bone and lace. And then from the doorway came the soft rustle of fabric. You opened your eyes slowly. Mrs. Rutherford stood there, her expression unreadable, one hand resting lightly on the doorframe. Her eyes were distant, yet fixed on you, as if she were peering through time and seeing not just one version of you, but many. "I didn't know you played," she said after a pause. You let your hands fall to your lap. "Neither did I." She stepped into the room, walking slowly. The lines of her face looked gentler in the late light. She did not sit but stood near the window, gazing out into the garden. "That song," she murmured. "Your mother played it, only once and never again." You froze. "She played it on the day your father left, just after the letter arrived." You swallowed, throat tight. "What letter?" Mrs. Rutherford turned toward you now, eyes clearer, but shadowed with old grief. "He was already gone, to America, but the letter said he would not return, that business had become complicated, that he wished to send for you both eventually. But of course, he never did. The fire in the hearth crackled faintly behind you. I don't remember her playing, you said. Mrs. Rutherford smiled faintly. You were small, barely 5. You sat beneath the piano. I remember you wouldn't come out, not even when she called you. A weight settled over your chest, not from pain exactly, but from the dense and solemn realization of having belonged to a past you could no longer reach. Mrs. Rutherford stepped closer. She loved you more fiercely than anyone I've known, she said. But after he left, something in her changed. She was still warm, still kind, but she became quieter, like the world had spoken too loudly and she was learning how to hear again. You nodded slowly. I've wondered what became of her, you whispered. She passed in London. Consumption, gentle, but quick. Her voice softened. You were sent to stay with a family friend for some time, and then back here, with us, with me. You blinked back the sting behind your eyes. I should have told you sooner, she added. But grief has its own schedule, and memory is a house with many locked rooms. You stood then slowly, the piano bench scraping lightly against the carpet. I want to remember her, you said, truly. Mrs. Rutherford reached out and took your hand. Her skin was paper thin, cool, and trembled slightly. Then let's begin, she said. And together, in that golden lit room that smelled faintly of dust and old music, she told you stories, small things, mostly. Your mother's fondness for elderflower cordial, her habit of humming while peeling apples, the way she would forget her gloves in every room, her delight at the first snowfall of the year, how she'd once caught a hedgehog in the garden and tried to name it Percival. You listened, greedily, not because the stories were grand, but because they were hers. Because in every detail, you stitched something back into the shape of a woman who had once been your world, who, in her own silent way, had taught you how to endure. When the stories faded into stillness, the light had turned to shadow. Mrs. Rutherford stood and kissed your cheek. I'm going to rest, she said, but I'm glad we spoke. You watched her leave, the faint scent of lavender trailing after her, and then you sat back at the piano. This time, you did not play the melody by instinct. You played it by choice. Each note was slow, deliberate. You shaped it carefully, as if weaving it from breath, from memory, from love buried beneath decades of silence. And as the final note hung in the air, trembling faintly, you understood something so simple, it felt like grace. To remember is to love again, even across oceans, even across time. The following days unfolded like the pages of a worn book, slowly, quietly, with the weight of meaning tucked to the soft folds of routine. Mornings were cloaked in fog and the scent of coal smoke. Afternoons offered dappled light across the sitting room carpets and the murmuring of voices behind closed doors. You moved through them not as a guest in Edith's world anymore, but as something quieter, more rooted. Not quite native to the soil, but no longer foreign to it. The new notebook, your notebook, remained mostly untouched. It wasn't for lack of feeling. If anything, your days brimmed with things that asked to be recorded. Clara's absent-minded humming as she adjusted the curtains, the peculiar sound of Mrs. Weatherby laughing in her sleep from the next room, the thrill of a sudden rainstorm that sent everyone rushing to bring the washing in. You noticed everything. You remembered more. But still, the blank pages waited, patient as snow. You weren't ready yet, but soon. On the third morning since your visit to the Dovecot, Thomas found you in the orchard. You hadn't planned to be there long, only to walk among the trees while the ground was still cool, their branches dripping with the remnants of dew. But you had lingered, sitting beneath a low-limbed apple tree, the hem of your dress gathering leaves and earth. The tree above you bore small, pale fruit, weeks yet from ripeness, but the birds already quarreled among the boughs. You didn't hear him at first, only felt the sudden presence of stillness in the air. He stood a few paces away, his coat unbuttoned, a folded letter in one hand. His expression was softer than usual, though his eyes looked as if they had recently emerged from a long thought. I wondered if you'd be here, he said, approaching slowly. You offered a quiet smile. Is that where I'm known to vanish now? Into places the rest of us forget to look, yes. He sat beside you without asking, folding his long legs into the grass with a practiced ease. For a moment, neither of you spoke. The orchard was hushed, save for the low rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of twigs beneath a squirrel's claws. You've changed, he said gently. So have you. He glanced sideways at you, amused. I haven't had anything quite so dramatic as your transformation. Haven't you? You plucked a blade of grass. I think you've become quieter. I'm always quiet. No, you used to fill silences with wit. Now you let them speak. Thomas was quiet for a moment, then gave a small nod. Maybe we're both becoming something else. You looked down at his hands. He was still holding the folded letter. Is that for me? You asked. He blinked. It was. You waited. I wrote it last night, he said. But reading it now, it doesn't feel right to give it to you. It belongs to a different version of you, one who might not know how to answer. You tilted your head. Try me. He looked at you for a long moment. Then, with a wry half smile, he handed you the letter. You unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was his, crisp, steady, slightly slanted. Edith, I don't know what word belongs here. Not dear, because we have never been that polite with each other. Not beloved, because such declarations sound like church bells when I mean a whisper. I suppose I simply want to say that I see you. Even as you become someone I do not fully recognize, I see the shape of you, the trace of something strong beneath the veil. I see your hands when they tremble and when they do not. I see your gaze when it lingers too long on the sea and your breath when it falters before sleep. You are not the girl I met, but neither am I the boy who met her. I do not ask you to explain. I ask only that you remember. You do not need to vanish in order to begin again. When you finished reading, the silence returned, but this time it was not emptiness. It was full, brimming with everything unsaid and everything unnecessary to say. You folded the letter carefully, returning it to his hand. Thank you, you whispered. Thomas didn't smile. Not quite, but something shifted in his posture, some invisible tightness that eased as he looked away toward the orchard path. I'm leaving for London tomorrow, he said. The words landed softly, but they bloomed wide inside you. For how long? A fortnight, maybe longer. My brothers asked me to help with a matter at the firm. Nothing glamorous, just papers and names I won't remember. You nodded slowly. I'll miss our walks, you said. He turned back to you then. I'll miss this version of you. You looked down at your hands in your lap. I don't know if she'll still be here when you return. Thomas was quiet for a breath. Then I hope the next one leaves her a note. You laughed softly. I'll see what I can do. The sun had begun to climb through the trees now, the mist burning off in golden rays. You sat together in the warmth, the earth still damp beneath you, the orchard alive with its own gentle breath. When you returned to the house later that morning, you brought with you a feeling that clung to your skin like wind after a storm, something unfinished, but not uncertain. You walked straight to your room. You opened your new notebook, and for the first time you wrote, not of the past, not of Edith, but of the moment, the now, the self that stood in between all names. And it felt like a beginning, even in its smallest shape. The train departed the next morning with a groan of steel and smoke, carrying Thomas back to London through the mist-laced countryside. You stood on the platform beside Mrs. Rutherford, your gloved hand resting lightly on the handle of your parasol, the hem of your skirt catching the breeze as the engine chugged into motion. He had not said much in the final moments, only pressed your hand in his, warm and sure, and held your gaze for a heartbeat longer than politeness allowed. You had not expected tears, and yet, as the last carriage vanished into the morning fog, a strange emptiness settled at your collarbone. Not grief, not even longing, just the unfamiliar quiet left behind when someone who sees you, truly sees you, steps out of sight. The platform emptied slowly. Mrs. Rutherford commented on the briskness of the morning and the necessity of finding the correct carriage for the return journey, her words neat and composed, designed to fill space. You nodded when needed, listened, but your mind wandered. Later, back at the house, the absence of Thomas moved like a draft through the corridors. The places he had occupied, the library chair, the second teacup on the drawing room table, the piano bench left askew, felt louder in his silence. And yet, you did not seek to fill them. You let them be, as if his presence, though gone, was still breathing somewhere in the walls. The afternoon passed with small things. You walked in the garden with Clara, who showed you the new crocuses breaking through the soil beside the path. Their petals were tight and shy, pale lavender like silk ribbons soaked in dew. She seemed lighter today, more talkative, her cheeks touched with color. I always feel a little braver when things start blooming, she said. It's like the world's remembering itself. You smiled at that. I think I know what you mean. Later, Mrs. Weatherby summoned you to help her sort correspondence. A series of stiff, formal notes arrived from London, some bearing embossed crests, others signed with names you did not recognize. You listened as she dictated brief replies, her voice sharp with precision, but there were moments, just barely, where her tone softened, where the edges of her formality unraveled, revealing wariness she would never name aloud. That evening, alone again in the blue room, you opened your notebook. Your handwriting had found its rhythm. The ink flowed like March 22nd. The house feels changed, though nothing has moved. I think absence rearranges us more than furniture. It teaches us where we were leaning without knowing. I do not miss Thomas in the way I feared I might. I miss the mirror he held up, gentle, patient. He made me want to speak, but more than that, he made me believe I had something worth saying. Perhaps that is what real presence is. Not someone who completes you, but someone who reminds you are already whole. You paused, pen poised above the paper. Then below the entry you added, I do not wish to disappear anymore. I wish to arrive. The words startled you with their finality, not because they were dramatic, but because they were true. You closed the notebook and leaned back in the chair. The fire had burned low. The lamp cast soft rings of light on the floor. Through the window, the moon had risen, thin and curved like a promise just beginning to be kept. In the quiet, you rose and moved toward the wardrobe. There, tucked into the back behind two heavy wool coats and a rarely worn riding habit, was a hat box. You didn't remember seeing it before. Perhaps Clara had placed it there recently. Perhaps it had always been waiting. You pulled it down gently and opened the lid. Inside, nestled in tissue and lavender sachet, was a bonnet, pale cream with a band of dusky rose velvet and a small embroidered lining along the brim. You reached out and lifted it, careful with the ties, and turned it in your hands. A note lay folded beneath. For spring. Your heart slowed. You could not be certain. Mother? Mrs. Rutherford? Another name lost in the folds of time? But the gesture held meaning, regardless of who had left it. The hat was lovely, new, but touched by care. Not a grand thing, but an offering, an invitation. You held it to your chest, eyes closed. Later, as the clock chimed 9 and the house slipped further into quiet, you stood at the mirror and placed the bonnet on your head. It fit perfectly, and somehow impossibly, you looked like someone stepping into her life rather than running from another. Downstairs, the front hall was hushed. The drawing room lamp still glowed, forgotten in a corner. You stepped outside into the night air, cool, clean, touched with wood smoke and the faint breath of early blossoms. No one followed. No one called you back. And for the first time since awakening in this borrowed skin, you walked not as a guest of time, not as a passenger in someone else's story, but as someone writing her own step by step into the quiet evening. The next morning brought with it a tender breeze, the kind that moved with the softness of silk, brushing through the garden hedges and rippling the edges of curtains left just slightly ajar. The sky was a gentle, forgiving blue, the first true blue you had seen in days, without the heavy veil of fog or the hesitant gray of rain. It felt, strangely, like the first morning of spring, not marked on a calendar, but revealed in the way the air touched the skin. Clara met you in the corridor with a curious smile. Will you be going out again today, Miss Edith? You paused, brushing a stray curl behind your ear. I think I might. Shall I pack a basket for you? You blinked. A basket? Clara's smile widened. It's the kind of day for it, isn't it? There's a slope near the chapel ruins, south-facing, quiet. You used to go there sometimes with your sketchbook. Sketchbook, another detail, another shape forming in the edges of Edith's life. That sounds perfect, you said. Half an hour later, Clara handed you the basket, lined with a blue gingham cloth and filled with simple pleasures. Buttered bread, slices of soft cheese, 2 small apples, and a flask of tea wrapped in a linen napkin. A folded blanket rested on top, and nestled beside it, to your quiet astonishment, was a leather-bound sketchbook and a tin of charcoal pencils. They were still in the drawer by your old desk, Clara said. I thought they might want the sun. You looked up at her, emotion rising quietly beneath your ribs. Thank you, you said, and meant it. She only curtsied lightly and added, the primroses are just starting to open. You left through the garden gate, the path bright beneath your boots. The wind carried the smell of tilled soil and warmed grass, and somewhere in the distance, the sea whispered its ancient lullaby. Your skirt brushed against tall tufts of early clover, and your hands, ungloved today, drank in the cool of the morning air. The chapel ruins came into view like an old friend. Perched on a rise of earth overlooking the far edge of the estate, they were little more than a skeleton of stones now, a single archway, a fragment of wall, and 3 crooked steps that led nowhere. But there was beauty in their solitude, beauty in what remained. You laid the blanket on a patch of moss and sat, legs folded beneath you. Around you, the earth buzzed faintly with the life of insects and distant birdsong. A bee meandered past, drunk on the scent of something not yet in bloom. You removed the sketchbook from the basket, opened it, and hesitated. The pages were mostly blank. There were only a few faint traces, an unfinished outline of a flower, a landscape reduced to a suggestion of hills. The strokes were light, cautious, as if Edith had never given herself permission to complete them. You turned to a clean page and took one of the pencils in your hand. It rested there easily, as if waiting. You weren't sure what you meant to draw. Not the chapel, not the orchard. Instead, your hand moved of its own accord, slow and searching. At first, it felt clumsy, then comforting. The line curved, narrowed, widened. A profile took shape, not detailed, not perfect. A figure sitting beneath a tree, head bent towards something unseen. You didn't label it, didn't frame it with meaning. You only drew. It wasn't about art, it was about stillness, about returning. Hours passed without notice. The tea cooled, the apples softened in the warmth of the basket. Shadows shifted as the sun traced its path across the sky. And all the while, the page before you slowly filled. You had just begun to shade the outline of the tree trunk when a voice startled you, low, familiar, and entirely unexpected. I thought I might find you here. Your heart kicked. You turned. Thomas stood at the edge of the ruined wall, boots dusty, hair windblown, coat half unbuttoned, as if he had not paused since stepping off the train. He held his hat in one hand, a folded letter in the other. You rose slowly, disbelief blooming into joy before you could conceal it. I thought you weren't to return for another week. He stepped closer, the wind tugging at the corners of his coat. I finished early. Why? Because I had something to say, and I was tired of writing it down. He offered you the folded paper, but you didn't take it. I already know, you said. His eyes searched yours. Do you? You nodded. I do. A moment passed between you, fragile and warm. Then, without another word, he sat beside you on the blanket. Together, you watched the wind move through the primroses, silent and soft. He glanced down at your sketchbook. Is that me? He asked, teasing gently. You looked down. Not yet, you said. But it could be. He leaned back on one elbow, looking at the sky. Funny, he murmured. I always imagined you would live in a city, one of those women with ink-stained fingers and loud opinions. Perhaps I will, you replied. Perhaps I already have. Thomas smiled. Then I hope she writes me letters. I think she already has, you said. He looked at you again, but this time he did not ask for clarity, because some moments ask only to be felt, not named. And there, in the golden hush of afternoon, with ruins at your back and paper at your knees, you did not worry about who you had been. You simply belonged. The air changed as the sun began its slow descent, the warmth peeling away layer by layer, leaving behind a hush that clung to the earth like a woolen shawl. You and Thomas remained beneath the arch of the old chapel ruins, neither of you speaking for a long while. It wasn't the kind of silence that demanded to be filled. It was a shared language in itself, comfortable, deliberate, and whole. Eventually, he reached for one of the apples left in the basket, turning it thoughtfully in his hand before taking a quiet bite. The sound, crisp and sudden, seemed to startle a nearby blackbird into flight. You smiled. We've ruined the moment. He grinned, chewing. Moments should be ruined. That's how you know they're real. You tore off a small piece of bread and nibbled at it, watching a trail of ants weave their way along the frayed edge of the blanket. The sketchbook remained open beside you, your pencil tucked neatly in its spine. I think I've spent so much time trying to become someone, you said softly, that I forgot how to simply be. Thomas leaned back on his elbow again, His eyes turned to the sky. It's not always easy, being, especially when people expect you to perform it like a part. You looked at him then. Did you expect something of me? His smile faded, not in disappointment but in thoughtfulness. No, he said, but I hoped. You let the words settle between you. They didn't sting. They didn't even surprise. Hope, you were learning, was not always a burden placed on someone else's shoulders. Sometimes it's the kind of quiet offering one made to the world, whether answered or not. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the ivy that curled over the ruins. You glanced down at the worn stones beneath your feet. Names, initials, moss-covered carvings. Time had etched itself into everything here, even the earth. I think Edith came here often, you said, mostly to yourself. Thomas's brow furrowed gently. You speak of her as though she's not you. You didn't look at him. Sometimes I wonder if she was. He was quiet, and when you finally met his gaze again, there was no confusion in his expression, only a soft understanding that made your throat tighten. She was someone else, you said, and I carry her with me, but I'm no longer her alone. Thomas nodded, slow and sure. Then tell me who you are now. You opened your mouth, but no words came. Instead, you reached for the sketchbook, flipped to a blank page, and placed it gently between you. I don't know yet, you said, but I'm ready to find out. His eyes lit with something, pride perhaps, or something deeper, more ancient. A recognition of the courage it took not to name yourself too soon. You closed the book and began to gather the things into the basket. The blanket was damp along the edges, but it smelled of grass and sun, and you didn't mind. He helped you fold it, his fingers brushing yours in a gesture that lingered just long enough to make your breath catch. The walk back to the house was slow. The path curved gently, rising and falling with the soft terrain. Trees lined the way, their bare branches casting long shadows now as dusk crept in. You passed the dovecote on your left, silent and gray, but still standing, the place where Edith had carved her truth into the stone. There are things only silence understands. You touched the side of the building as you passed, fingertips trailing along the cool stones. You didn't need to speak it aloud. You understood it now. The house came into view through the trees, its windows already glowing with the first light of evening. Smoke rose from the chimneys in slow curls. You could just make out Clara in the kitchen garden, gathering herbs in her apron, the way she always did before supper. Thomas paused before the gate. I'll walk back to the inn from here, he said. You nodded, adjusting the strap of the basket on your shoulder. Will you come tomorrow? You asked. If you'll have me. You smiled. Then come early. The sea will want to be heard by then. He reached up then, gently brushing a loose strand of hair from your forehead. His hand lingered for just a moment. Not possessive, not even tender, just present. I'll see you, he said. And with that, he turned and walked down the path, his figure slowly swallowed by the trees and dusk. You entered through the side door, slipping into the warmth of the house. The scent of roast parsnips and fresh thyme greeted you. A kettle sang softly in the distance. Clara glanced up from the kitchen hearth and smiled. Back just in time, she said, brushing her hands on her apron. You set the basket down and removed your shawl, folding it with care. Everything felt quieter now, but not empty. Just settled, like water after a stone had been dropped into it. That evening, you wrote again. March 23rd. Today I did not feel haunted. Not by the past, not by the weight of another name. Today I stood where Edith stood, and I did not vanish into her. I remembered her, and I walked with her, but I spoke in my own voice. And when he looked at me, I think he saw that. You set down the pen, and for the first time, the silence in the room did not ask you to explain yourself. It simply welcomed you in. The air changed as the sun began its slow descent, the warmth peeling away layer by layer, leaving behind a hush that clung to the earth like a woolen shawl. You and Thomas remained beneath the arch of the old chapel ruins, neither of you speaking for a long while. It wasn't the kind of silence that demanded to be filled. It was a shared language in itself, comfortable, deliberate, and whole. Eventually, he reached for one of the apples left in the basket, turning it thoughtfully in his hand before taking a quiet bite. The sound, crisp and sudden, seemed to startle a nearby blackbird into flight. You smiled. We've ruined the moment. He grinned, chewing. Moments should be ruined, That's how you know they're real. You tore off a small piece of bread and nibbled at it, watching a trail of ants weave their way along the frayed edge of the blanket. The sketchbook remained open beside you, your pencil tucked neatly in its spine. I think I've spent so much time trying to become someone, you said softly, that I forgot how to simply be. Thomas leaned back on his elbow again, his eyes turned to the sky. It's not always easy, being, especially when people expect you to perform it like a part. You looked at him then. Did you expect something of me? His smile faded, not in disappointment, but in thoughtfulness. No, he said, but I hoped. You let the words settle between you. They didn't sting. They didn't even surprise. Hope, you were learning, was not always a burden placed on someone else's shoulders. Sometimes it was the kind of quiet offering one made to the world, whether answered or not. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the ivy that curled over the ruins. You glanced down at the worn stones beneath your feet. Names, initials, moss-covered carvings. Time had etched itself into everything here, even the earth. I think Edith came here often, you said, mostly to yourself. Thomas's brow furrowed gently. You speak of her as though she's not you. You didn't look at him. Sometimes I wonder if she was. He was quiet, and when you finally met his gaze again, there was no confusion in his expression, only a soft understanding that made your throat tighten. She was someone else, you said, and I carry her with me, but I'm no longer her alone. Thomas nodded, slow and sure. Then tell me who you are now. You opened your mouth, but no words came. Instead, you reached for the sketchbook, flipped to a blank page, and placed it gently between you. I don't know yet, you said, but I'm ready to find out. His eyes lit with something, pride, perhaps, or something deeper, more ancient. A recognition of the courage it took not to name yourself too soon. You closed the book and began to gather the things into the basket. The blanket was damp along the edges, but it smelled of grass and sun, and you didn't mind. He helped you fold it, his fingers brushing yours in a gesture that lingered just long enough to make your breath catch. The walk back to the house was slow. The path curved gently, rising and falling with the soft terrain. Trees lined the way, their bare branches casting long shadows now as dusk crept in. You passed the dovecote on your left, silent and gray, but still standing, the place where Edith had carved her truth into the stone. There are things only silence understands. You touched the side of the building as you passed, fingertips trailing along the cool stone. You didn't need to speak it aloud. You understood it now. The house came into view through the trees, its windows already glowing with the first light of evening. Smoke rose from the chimneys in slow curls. You could just make out Clara in the kitchen garden, gathering herbs in her apron, the way she always did before supper. Thomas paused before the gate. I'll walk back to the inn from here, he said. You nodded, adjusting the strap of the basket on your shoulder. Will you come tomorrow? You asked. If you'll have me. You smiled. Then come early. The sea will want to be heard by then. He reached up then, gently brushing a loose strand of hair from your forehead. His hand lingered for just a moment. Not possessive, not even tender, just present. I'll see you, he said. And with that, he turned and walked down the path, his figure slowly swallowed by the trees and dusk. You entered through the side door, slipping into the warmth of the house. The scent of roast parsnips and fresh thyme greeted you. A kettle sang softly in the distance. Clara glanced up from the kitchen hearth and smiled. Back just in time, she said, brushing her hands on her apron. You set the basket down and removed your shawl, folding it with care. Everything felt quieter now, but not empty, just settled, like water after a stone had been dropped into it. That evening, you wrote again. March 23rd. Today I did not feel haunted. Not by the past, not by the weight of another name. Today I stood where Edith stood, and I did not vanish into her. I remembered her, and I walked with her, but I spoke in my own voice. And when he looked at me, I think he saw that. You set down the pen, and for the first time, the silence in the room did not ask you to explain yourself. It simply welcomed you in. The morning of March 24th arrived with an unexpected clarity. The light that spilled through your bedroom window was bright and clean, filtered through freshly washed glass and the fine threads of lace curtains. It was the kind of light that made everything seem newly drawn. The dresser more detailed, the porcelain pitcher more luminous, the very walls of the room breathing with quiet attention. You dressed without Clara's help, not out of defiance, but out of a blooming independence you hadn't even noticed growing. A pale green walking dress, simple and unadorned except for the scalloped embroidery at the hem. You pinned your hair loosely, letting a few soft curls frame your face. There was no rush, no ceremony, just readiness, as though your own skin finally felt like home again. Downstairs, the house was stirring gently. Mrs. Weatherby had already retired to the breakfast room with a letter from her sister clutched like a weapon of mild irritation. Mrs. Rutherford was not yet visible, but had likely retreated to the conservatory, where she'd taken to sitting quietly in the mornings, surrounded by the scent of citrus and warm stone. Clara passed you in the corridor, a stack of linens in her arms. "You'll want your shawl," she said without pausing. "There's a chill on the wind, even if the sun pretends otherwise." You smiled after her. "I'll remember." But you didn't take the shawl. Instead, you opened the front door and stepped out into the bright cool of late March. The garden glistened in patches of dew, but the paths were dry. Crocuses and early violets dotted the borders, tiny flags of defiance against the memory of winter. You walked slowly, letting your feet follow the familiar route past the rose arbor, down the gravel lane, and through the small iron gate that opened toward the sea. Thomas was already there. He stood near the edge of the cliff walk, hands in his coat pockets, gazing toward the horizon where the water glimmered with the slow pulse of the tide. He turned at the sound of your steps, his expression brightening before settling into something quieter, more intimate. "I was beginning to think you'd chosen a different view today," he said. "I thought about it," you replied, "but this one suits the morning." He nodded and fell into step beside you as you began to walk. The sea below moved in slow, deliberate strokes, the waves whispering against the shore far beneath the cliffs. The wind toyed gently with your skirts, lifting the hem just enough to remind you it still carried winter in its breath. Neither of you spoke for a while. There was no need. It was Thomas who broke the silence first, his voice low and thoughtful. "I dreamed of you last night." You glanced at him. "Oh? Not this you exactly. Not even the Edith I first knew. It was someone in between. She was walking through a hallway full of mirrors, but none of them showed her reflection." Your heart stirred. "What did they show?" He looked ahead. "Places, people, moments. Some I recognized, some I didn't." But she wasn't afraid. She stopped at each mirror, looked in, and kept walking. You breathed in slowly, letting the image settle. "I think that's what I've been doing," you said. "I know." You paused at a break in the path where a stone bench overlooked the cliffs. You sat, the sea breeze brushing cool fingers against your cheeks. Thomas remained standing just to your right, hands still in his pockets. "I've been wondering something," you said, eyes on the horizon. "Ask it. Why didn't you try harder to hold me in place when I began to change?" He was quiet for a long time, and then, "Because I'd rather walk beside you than drag you back to where you were." You turned to him, and this time you didn't smile. You let the truth of the moment rest between you like sunlight on water. "I don't know where I'm going yet," you said. "That's not a flaw. But I do know I want to remember what came before, not because I'm bound to it, but because I want to understand how I've grown past it." Thomas sat beside you then. "I don't need you to explain yourself to me, Edith, or whatever name you carry now, but if you do choose to share it, I'll listen." You looked down at your hands, folded in your lap. "There's a part of me," you said quietly, "that still wonders if I'll wake up in my old life, that all of this will dissolve, and I'll be back in my apartment, staring at a ceiling fan, wondering if I dreamed a century." He nodded. "And what would you miss most?" You hesitated. "Then, the way the world moves slower here. How time has texture, how every moment feels like it could be a page worth keeping." Thomas reached over, not to take your hand, but simply to rest his fingers beside yours on the bench. "Then write it down," he said. "Make it real." You stared at the sea, and for the first time since arriving in this life, you felt that you had not fallen backward, but forward. Not out of your world, but deeper into another that had waited patiently for you to notice it. When you returned to the house, the sun high and strong behind your shoulders, you did not go to your room. You went to the library. There at the writing desk tucked near the east-facing window, you opened your notebook. You wrote of the mirrors, the waves, the wind. And at the top of the page, above it all, you wrote just one word: begin. Afternoon light filtered through the tall library windows, falling in long golden lines across the carpet like the quiet bars of a sunlit cage, beautiful and unmoving. You sat at the writing desk, the leather-bound notebook open before you, your pen poised but not yet touching the page again. The last word you had written, begin, still hovered in the air, as though it had not merely been written but spoken aloud, declared softly to the room itself. Outside, the garden had settled into a drowsy hush. The breeze had slowed to a mere breath, and the trees stood still, their shadows reaching gently across the walls of the house. Even the birds seemed contemplative, their songs more spaced, more reflective. Behind you, the soft knock at the library door was barely audible. You turned in your chair as Clara stepped in, a letter in hand. Post arrived earlier than usual, she said, walking across the room. This one's for you, miss, from London. Your pulse flickered. Clara laid the envelope on the desk with gentle care. It was cream-colored, heavy, and sealed in a pale red wax that bore no crest, only the impression of a single leaf. She glanced down at it, then back at you. Shall I bring tea? You nodded. Please. When she was gone, you lifted the letter. It bore your name in a hand you didn't recognize. Not Thomas's. This script was slightly more formal, more hesitant. Still, it was familiar in a way that troubled the edges of your memory. You broke the seal. Miss Hargrave, I hope this finds you in comfort and calm. I write not out of presumption, but because I believe there are things owed to you. Stories, mostly. Names, if nothing else. I am told you are living with the Rutherfords again, and that you are, as ever, quite changed. This is not said unkindly. Change, I believe, is the only honest state a person may inhabit. You may not remember me. Perhaps the illness did more than we understood. Or perhaps memory was never the place where we truly knew one another. In any case, I do not write to stir sorrow, only to offer clarity if you should want it. I was a friend to your mother once, a close one, before London, before everything. She confided things to me, and I kept them too long in silence. But there is one thing you should know. Your father did not leave by choice. He did not send you a letter. He never had the chance. I know this may raise more questions than it answers. If you wish to know more, write to me. I will not intrude, but the truth belongs to you now. With sincerity, you read the letter twice, then folded it slowly, fingers trembling. The room was too still now. The clock on the mantel ticked with unreasonable sharpness. A single beam of sunlight slanted across the desk, illuminating the letter like an object of devotion or guilt. You stood and walked to the window, the letter still in your hand. Your father had not left by choice. The words repeated themselves in your mind, not loud, but persistent, like the steady dripping of a faucet in a silent house. He did not send you a letter. He never had the chance. It was as though a floorboard beneath you had shifted, not broken, not crumbled, but moved, revealing something below you had never thought to question. The architecture of memory is delicate, after all, and yours had been built on the quiet conviction of abandonment, a conviction that now no longer belonged to you. You sat back down slowly, placing the letter beside your notebook. When Clara returned with the tea, you said nothing. She placed the tray gently on the desk, poured a cup without asking, and lingered only a moment longer than necessary. You look as though the weather's changed, she said softly. You managed a faint smile. Perhaps it has. She nodded and left the room. You sat there a long time, staring at the tea, watching the steam rise, curl, vanish. Then you opened your notebook. You wrote, I have lived so long in the shape of a story I thought was true. Now I must live again, not in spite of the old story, but beside it. My father did not abandon me. My mother did not tell me. I do not know what they were protecting me from, or if they were protecting me at all. But the silence was not empty. It was full of choices, their choices, and now I choose mine. You paused. Then beneath it, you added, the story changes here, not because the past is undone, but because I'm no longer afraid to meet it. You closed the notebook and let your fingers rest upon the cover. For a long time, you did nothing else. You only breathed, letting the stillness wrap around you like a shawl. You felt not sad, but sobered, as though the world had just shifted its weight slightly on its axis. That evening, you walked to the folly. You didn't bring the sketchbook or the notebook or even your shawl, just yourself. Your boots moved slowly over the familiar path, each step grounded, unhurried. When you reached the stone arch, you sat on the edge of the bench, listening. The brook whispered in the distance. The trees were just beginning to bud with green, and you spoke softly into the air. I know you didn't leave, and I know she tried to carry that silence for both of you. It was not an accusation, it was a kindness, and the trees, in their slow spring awakening, seemed to bow in agreement. The following morning felt different before your eyes even opened. There was a stillness to it, but not the ordinary hush of early hours. It was something deeper, a kind of quiet that settled not just on the house, but in you, as though every breath had been placed gently in the center of a clean page, waiting for the pen to touch down. You sat up slowly in bed, the blue room wrapped in the pale hush of pre-dawn. Outside, the sky was just beginning to tint with soft color, lavender and pewter, and the faintest suggestion of gold. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and wood smoke, as though the world itself had exhaled during the night. You dressed without thought, hands moving automatically, slipping into a simple walking gown the color of river stones. No jewelry, no ornament, only a ribbon in your hair, tied loosely behind one ear. Downstairs, Clara was already at the stove, coaxing the flame under the kettle, her sleeves rolled to the elbows. She smiled when she saw you, but didn't speak. Neither did you. It was too early for words, and both of you knew it. You took your tea into the conservatory. The glass panes were still streaked with dew, and the citrus trees stood like quiet sentinels in their pots. You curled into the armchair closest to the eastern window and let the steam from your cup warm your cheeks. The first light touched the tops of the leaves, turning them a deeper green, almost glowing. You had brought the notebook with you, cradled under one arm like a secret. When you set it on your lap and opened it, the pages fluttered softly in the breeze that slipped in through the transom. You flipped past earlier entries, words heavy with questions, with ache, with the quiet mourning of a life stepped into without a map. You stopped on a fresh page and pressed your hand flat against it. The letter from MH still lay in the drawer upstairs, folded carefully, as if reverence could keep it from unraveling. But the words lived now in your bones, not your desk. You picked up the pen and began to write. March 25th. I did not lose a father. I lost the story of him I had carried all this time, and in its place I now hold something far more delicate, the unknown. There is pain in that, but also possibility. He did not leave, he was taken. And she, my mother, chose silence, not out of cowardice, but protection, or perhaps sorrow, perhaps both. I don't know yet if I forgive her, but I do understand her. You paused, the weight of that last sentence resting gently against your ribs. There is a difference between knowing and understanding. I knew the loss, but I am only just beginning to understand the grief. And maybe now I can begin to forgive. The light had crept further into the room, warming the tiles beneath your feet. You heard the distant thud of someone stirring upstairs. The house was beginning to wake. You closed the notebook and placed it on the side table. And then you did something you hadn't done since that first uncertain morning weeks ago. You took out a sheet of blank stationery, the good kind, with the thin ribbed texture and the envelope lined in soft gray. It bore no crest, no initials. It didn't need them. You dipped your pen, let the ink settle at the tip, and began. Thank you for telling me what no one else could. I would like to know more. Not just about him, but about her, about the years before London, about who she was when she laughed. You said memory was not where we truly knew one another. I think that's true, but I'd like to try anyway. You'll find me at the same place, the blue room at the top of the stairs, the window that faces east. Write to me again. You signed the name without hesitation this time, not as a performance, not as a costume, but as a thread connecting past to present. You sealed the envelope and handed it to Clara before noon, asking if she might post it before the rain returned. She didn't ask questions, just nodded and tucked it safely beneath her apron. The rest of the day passed quietly. You helped Mrs. Rutherford choose fabrics for the guest room, soft damasks and floral muslins, none of which truly mattered, except that she wanted your opinion. You peeled carrots in the kitchen with Clara, the scent of thyme and onions rising around you as the soup began to simmer. You sat with Mrs. Weatherby as she dozed beside the fire, her knitting resting in her lap, her breath slow and even. But it was in the evening, when the lamps were lit and the fire glowed low in the hearth, that you returned once more to the desk, not to write, not to read, but to sit in stillness, to listen. And in that silence, you could almost hear your mother's voice, not her words, but the tone, the cadence, the soft echo of her humming as she folded linens or steeped tea, a presence stitched invisibly through the fabric of your days. And you understood then that you were no longer searching for her in memories. You were carrying her forward, one quiet page at a time. By March 27th, the weather had changed again. It was subtle, not dramatic. The kind of shift that slipped in during the night and rearranged the air by morning. You felt it first through the floorboards, cooler, crisper. The light was thinner, whiter. The sky overhead was cloudless but held the faint bite of wind behind its brightness. The garden, once expectant and yawning into bloom, now seemed to draw inward again, as if the crocuses and violets were pausing to listen. And so did you. You walked the house as if it were a cathedral that day, not out of reverence, but attentiveness, touching the banister as though it might whisper to you, standing longer at the window, watching the slow sway of branches. Everything seemed both old and alive. In the early afternoon, a second letter arrived. Clara found you in the back parlor, near the globe with the cracked equator, where you had taken to sitting lately, warmed by the high sun through the glass. She held the envelope in both hands. "It's from the same hand, miss," she said, not smiling, not frowning, just watching you. You took it gently. The wax seal was the same pale red, the same leaf. The handwriting, still measured but a little less formal. The stroke softer. You broke the seal. "Eat it. Your letter reached me sooner than I expected. Or perhaps I should say, you reached me. I did not know if you would write back. I would have understood if you hadn't. There are things you've asked to know. I will share them in time. But allow me to begin with a story that isn't quite about your mother, or your father, or even you. Not at first. It is about a girl I once knew who kept her thoughts in tiny boxes inside her mind. Not to hide them, but to preserve them, like dried lavender, like old letters in drawers no one opened. She was luminous in the quietest way. Not the kind that fills a room, but the kind that makes you turn toward her in a crowded one. Your mother did not command attention. She earned it through softness, through listening, through the courage of her silences. She loved fiercely, and when she lost, she did so in private. Her heartbreak was not made of wailing or trembling. It was made of empty teacups, of unwritten songs, of letters torn into small pieces and buried in her garden. I believe you carry that same strength, that same shape of sorrow, but I also believe you are more than her echo. Let's not rush this. Truth comes gently when it's ready, and so I'll write again soon with the rest. Until then, live in the in-between. Let the past follow slowly, not lead. With care. You didn't move for a long time. You sat with the letter folded softly in your lap, the warmth from the window dimming as the sun shifted just enough to cast the parlor into light shadow. Your breath came evenly. There was no rush of clarity, no sudden revelation, just the deepening of something already stirring. Your mother in this letter was not just a woman lost. She was a woman lived, remembered not for the moment she left, but for all the small ways she had remained. Later, you returned to the blue room. You did not bring the notebook this time. You brought the sketchbook. You opened it to a blank page, took the charcoal in your hand, and began, not with faces, not with forms, but with shadows. Lines that curved and folded. A window. A hand resting beside a teacup. A curtain drawn half back. Details too small to name, but large enough to feel. You sketched the absence, and in doing so, you made space for what had been. When the light faded and the cold crept in along the edges of the floor, you lit the small lamp on your desk. Its glow was soft, golden. You didn't write anything down that night. You simply sat there, and in the quiet, a new understanding settled around you, not as an answer, but as a kind of permission. You did not have to hurry toward the end of the story. You were still in the middle, and the middle was full of light. By March 30th, the middle of everything had softened. The days no longer passed with urgency. nor did they feel as though they needed your full attention to be complete. Time moved like fabric now, folding gently around you, letting you carry it without effort. There were fewer questions left clawing at the corners of your mind, and more moments that simply asked to be noticed. That morning, the sun came early. You woke to it painting the far wall of your room in long strokes of honey gold, touching the edges of your dressing table, warming the cool glass of the pitcher on your washstand. You sat up slowly, stretching beneath the quilt, and for the first time in many weeks, your first thought wasn't of Edith or of what she might have done that day. It was of your own body, your own breath, your own simple hunger for tea and quiet. Downstairs, the household moved with its usual rhythm, the clink of crockery in the kitchen. Mrs. Weatherby's voice, measured and formal, issuing some gentle correction to the parlor maid. Clara humming in the back corridor, always off-key, always comfortingly near. In the drawing room, someone had opened the tall windows. A breeze slipped in and stirred the curtains, carrying with it the scent of daffodils and early hyacinth from the garden beyond. You stood there a long while, breathing it in. Later, you found yourself walking the back fields, your hands tucked into the folds of your skirt, a ribbon tied loosely in your hair. The grass was drier now, and the path more familiar beneath your boots. There were signs of spring everywhere if you knew how to look. The tight green of hedgerows just beginning to leaf, the insects darting low across puddles drying in the sun, the birds calling not in mourning but in expectation. At the crest of the hill, you paused. From there, the sea was only a sliver on the horizon, flat and blue, quiet and unreachable. The wind moved your dress gently around your legs. You closed your eyes. You thought of all that had passed. Not just the questions and the answers, the letters and the silences, but the thousands of unnamed moments that had formed this quiet becoming. The way Thomas had looked at you when he returned early. The weight of the unopened sketchbook in your hands, and the first time you dared to draw something not hers, but yours. The note tucked into the bonnet box, unsigned but deeply felt. The sound of your mother's imagined humming, not fading but returning, echoing softly through the folds of your memory. You had come here, uninvited by time, dropped into a life you did not understand, and yet somehow you had made a home within its walls. You walked back slowly. When you returned, you passed through the kitchen. Clara was kneading dough at the table, flour smudged across her cheek. She looked up, smiled. "Tea?" she asked. You nodded, hanging your shawl by the door. "Yes, but not in here." She wiped her hands. "The orchard?" "No," you said. "The folly." She tilted her head. "Something special?" You smiled. "Yes, me." Clara didn't ask. She just poured the tea into a small carafe, wrapped 2 slices of shortbread in muslin, and handed you the parcel with her usual care. Then she returned to her dough without another word. At the folly, the shadows were long, but the air warm. You laid the blanket across the mossy bench, poured the tea into a chipped enamel cup, and sat with your back to the stones. You took out your notebook, yours now, not Edith's, and opened to the next blank page. You wrote slowly, thoughtfully, each word not forced, but earned. "Today I am not grieving. Not because the grief has ended, but because it has changed. It no longer holds me by the throat. It walks beside me now. It lets me sleep. I do not know where this story will end. I don't need to. I know only that I am here, still, fully, and I am no longer a stranger to the life I'm living." You looked up at the arch above you, traced the cracks with your eyes, felt the sun on your skin, the stone against your spine. You did not need to speak aloud to know that you had arrived. Not in Edith's story, not even in the past, but in yourself, and at last it felt enough. The final morning of March arrived gently, wrapped in silver mist, and the slow rustle of branches greeting the breeze. The house stirred softly, like an old instrument waking beneath practiced hands. You woke before the bells of the nearby chapel rang, before Clara's first footsteps crossed the kitchen tiles, before the fire had been stirred to life in the drawing room hearth. There was no urgency in your rising, only calm. The kind that came not from knowing all the answers, but from no longer needing to ask the same questions. You dressed in a gown you hadn't worn since your first week in Brighton, a soft cream with a faded blue sash, loose at the waist, slightly worn at the cuffs. You'd avoided it then because it felt too close to who Edith had been before, too sentimental, But now, as you buttoned it carefully, you saw it differently. Not a costume, but a memory. A conversation between then and now. In the mirror, you looked like someone both returned and renewed. The woman staring back no longer startled you. She wasn't unfamiliar, nor was she fully known. She was simply yours. When you stepped into the hallway, the boards no longer creaked beneath your steps. Or perhaps you no longer noticed. The silence wasn't something to fear anymore. It had become your companion, your ally, your space to fill. You found Mrs. Rutherford in the morning room, reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, the newspaper folded neatly in her lap. She looked up as you entered. "You're early," she said, a note of pleasant surprise in her voice. You smiled. "I didn't want the day to begin without me." She reached over and poured a second cup of tea without asking. "That's a very fine instinct, my dear," she said, handing it to you. You sat across from her, warmed not just by the porcelain in your hand, but by the quiet ease between you. The two of you didn't speak much over tea. You had discovered together that some companionship was best measured not in conversation, but in presence. The clock ticked gently behind you. When you finished your cup, you excused yourself with a light touch to her shoulder. She didn't ask where you were going. She only nodded once, her fingers brushing lightly over yours. You walked slowly through the house, stopping in doorways without entering. The music room, still holding the scent of polish and old lace. The small upstairs sitting room where the light hit the walls just right after 3 in the afternoon. The staircase, which had once felt like a threshold you weren't ready to cross, and now simply belonged beneath your feet. Outside, the garden shimmered faintly with dew. You walked past the rose arbor, where new buds swelled in tightly guarded promise. The orchard, where Thomas had once sat beside you and asked no questions. The dovecot, silent and strong in its purposeful ruin. You didn't go to the folly. Not today. That part of the story had already been told. Instead, you walked toward the eastern gate, and beyond it, the edge of the sea. The cliff path stretched out ahead, ribboning through the tall grasses and heather. Below, the waves moved slowly, steadily, not crashing but breathing, a rhythm older than words. You followed the path until it brought you to a wide, flat rock near the edge, low enough to sit, high enough to see everything. You sat. The wind played gently with the hem of your dress, the ribbon in your hair. The salt air touched your skin like memory made real. You pulled the notebook from your satchel. Its pages were no longer stiff. They had been handled, lived in, bent and dog-eared and thumbed through. A book not of invention, but of witness. You opened to the last page. There was no need to prepare your words. They were already with you. You began to write. March 31st this morning, the sea did not ask who I was. It did not look to see which name I carried or what sorrow I wore. It simply moved toward the shore, away again, as it always has. I am not who I was when I first opened these pages. I am not Edith alone. I am not the woman who woke in a stranger's bed with borrowed memories and silent questions. I am something in between, something forward, something whole. There is no return from this kind of knowing. There is no need. I will keep walking, not because I am lost, but because I have finally begun. You closed the notebook and let the wind ruffle its edges. Then you tucked it carefully away. You remained seated for a while longer, watching the waves write their own long story across the sand far below. No one came. No one interrupted. You did not wait for a signal to rise, for a bell to chime, for a voice to call you home. You already were.